The cry that cut through silence. A river, a man, and the dog who refused to let go. There are mornings so still you can almost hear your own heartbeat echo off the trees. Daniel Rowe thought this would be one of those mornings, a quick stroll by the river before coffee. Nothing more. But the universe has a way of shattering routine when it needs your courage. As mist curled above the current, a single sound sliced the quiet. A desperate, high-pitched yelp that didn't belong to any bird. Daniel's pulse spiked. There, bobbing between shards of sunlight, was a tiny German shepherd pup locked in a losing fight with the river's icy pull. Boots hit mud, a coat hit grass. Daniel dove. What he pulled out wasn't just a trembling bundle of fur. It was the opening line of a story that would rewrite 2 broken lives. Stay with us, because in the next few minutes, you'll see how a half-drowned police dog named Echo turns a lonely cabin into a classroom on loyalty, resilience, and the healing power of second chances. The forest breathed in silence. Morning fog laced through the trees like whispers of something forgotten. Between the pines, shafts of pale light filtered through the canopy, flickering softly on patches of dew-covered moss. The air was sharp but not cruel clean, honest, like a page not yet written. Daniel Rowe walked slowly along the edge of the river, boots crunching softly against the frost-laced underbrush. His hands were buried deep in the pockets of his worn canvas coat, collar turned up against the chill. His face, framed by 3 days of scruff and tired eyes, was relaxed in a way that only solitude could allow. This was his ritual, his quiet hour. The river, broad and slow-moving, curled like a silver ribbon through the woods. It had become more than scenery to Daniel. It was a companion. It didn't demand small talk. It never asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. Its rhythm, soft and eternal, allowed his thoughts to drift like leaves on the current, weightless, unjudged. Daniel paused at a familiar bend in the path. A flat stone jutted out over the river's edge. He'd stood there dozens of times before, letting his memories ebb and flow with the water, sometimes painful, sometimes mercifully numb. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. The scent of pine needles, damp earth, and smoke from his cabin's chimney hung in the air. This moment, this exact hush was why he had come to the forest. Then he heard it. Faint at first, so faint he thought it might be a trick of the wind. A high-pitched cry, sharp and breathless, like a whisper caught in a scream. It was gone as quickly as it had come. Daniel opened his eyes, stood still, then again, louder this time. Desperate. His heartbeat quickened, his body shifting automatically into alert. A decade of search and rescue instincts that had lain dormant, now awoke without permission. He scanned the river, its surface calm in places but churning in others where rocks lay hidden beneath. Shadows moved between the ripples, but nothing distinct. The cry came again, higher-pitched, panicked. Daniel stepped closer to the bank, boots sinking into the soft mud. Then he saw it. A small shape, dark, barely larger than a football, fighting against the current near the far edge. It was being pulled downstream fast, limbs flailing. For a moment, it disappeared beneath the water. Daniel was already moving, shrugging off his coat and tossing it onto the frozen grass. His boots came off next, landing with a thud. The frigid bite of the river stabbed up through his legs the second he plunged in, but he didn't stop. "Hang on!" he shouted, his voice cracking against the roar of the current. He didn't know what he was swimming toward, but the need to reach it overwhelmed every rational thought. The water gripped him like ice claws, numbing his arms and dragging at his clothes. Each stroke forward felt like pulling against the weight of memory itself. But the figure surfaced again closer now, and Daniel saw it clearly for the first time. A German shepherd puppy, no more than 5 or 6 months old, its eyes wide with terror, legs thrashing without rhythm, a half-torn black harness still clinging to its small frame. Its head dipped again, a second, 2, then he reached it. Daniel's fingers brushed wet, fur slippery, trembling. He grabbed the harness, his other arm wrapping around the dog's torso. It didn't resist. No strength left, just a body going limp. He kicked hard, turning back toward the shore. The cold cut deeper now, his limbs aching, breath shallow. But he didn't let go, couldn't. As the bank came into reach, he dragged himself and the sodden dog up onto the grass, both of them collapsing in a heap. Daniel gasped for air, the weight of the moment sinking into his chest like stone. The pup wasn't moving. "No," he whispered, pushing himself up to his knees. He peeled off his flannel overshirt and wrapped it around the small body. The dog's chest heaved barely, but it was breathing. "You're all right. You're all right," he murmured, rocking slightly, as if trying to convince them both. The dog's body was trembling violently, its paws twitching, eyes half closed but not unconscious. A line of pale pink scar tissue was barely visible under the harness. Daniel pressed a hand gently to its chest, feeling the fragile rhythm of life. It was there but fading. He looked down at the pup, then at the river. Something in him shifted. A flicker, a tether being pulled taut. This wasn't just a rescue. He didn't know the dog's name. He didn't know what pain it carried or how it had ended up here. But he felt the weight of it like a mirror held to his soul. "I've got you," Daniel whispered, standing, holding the trembling bundle close to his chest. The forest stood still. Snowflakes began to fall, soft, tentative, like they, too, were waiting to see what would happen next. He walked quickly, carefully back toward the cabin, never once loosening his grip on the soaked, shaking creature in his arms. Behind them, the river kept flowing, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The river no longer sounded like water. It sounded like urgency, like panic dressed in white foam and icy rage. Daniel stood at the edge, boots deep in the mud, eyes fixed on the shape thrashing midstream. It was there undeniably real now, a German shepherd puppy, half drowned, tumbling in the current. Its head surfaced, then vanished beneath a cresting swell of snowmelt. A jagged strip of torn black harness clung to its side like a war-worn ribbon. He didn't think, didn't weigh the risk. In one fluid motion, Daniel threw off his jacket, letting it fall in a heap beside the boots he'd shed just seconds earlier. The cold snapped against his skin like a whip, but his feet were already in the water ankle, shin, then thigh deep. The shock of it stole the air from his lungs. A jolt so complete it could have stopped a weaker man's heart. But Daniel had been through worse. The current hit like a freight train. It sucked him forward, legs swept from under him, arms flailing to orient himself. But his eyes never left the pup. It bobbed again, a small, dark shape barely staying above the chop, its front paws slicing helplessly at nothing. "Hold on!" he shouted, though his voice was no match for the roar of the river. Ice water burned through his clothes, seeping into muscle and marrow. Every stroke forward was a battle his arms heavy, his legs already weakening. But the instincts from his old life kicked in. Horizontal positioning, strong strokes, use the current where you can. Don't panic, don't stop. He angled toward the pup, letting the current carry him closer. But every second counted. It was sinking more now, its movement slowing. He was no longer sure if it could hear or see him. Just when Daniel was nearly close enough to reach out, the puppy disappeared. "No, no, no, no." He lunged forward, arms outstretched into the icy void, heart pounding so violently it drowned out the rush of the river. His hand brushed wet, then slipped. A second grab caught hold of something solid. The harness, soaked and slick but still intact enough to grip. He closed his fist around it and yanked. Out of the churning depths, a small body emerged, coughing, limp, a set of terrified amber eyes meeting his just for a breath. "I've got you," he gasped, though the water filled his mouth a moment later. He shoved the dog's body against his chest, cradling it under one arm as he kicked hard toward the bank. But the river wasn't done. The weight of the dog, the current's drag, and the creeping cold fought him every inch of the way. His limbs screamed for oxygen, his vision blurred. The world narrowed to the rhythm of his strokes, and the desperate feel of fur clutched in his arms. Then his foot scraped something solid. Rock. He stumbled into shallower water, falling once, choking, then crawling with everything he had toward the shore. Mud sucked at his hands, but he didn't let go. Not for a second. When he finally collapsed onto the grass, his body was shaking so violently it barely obeyed him. He rolled to one side, pulling the dog close. The puppy was barely breathing, chest fluttering like a candle in the wind. Daniel tore off his flannel shirt, teeth chattering, and wrapped the dog tight, rubbing its body with numb hands, trying to force warmth back into the tiny frame. Its fur was soaked, clumped with debris. Its paws curled unnaturally. "Stay with me, stay, buddy. You're all right," he murmured over and over, voice cracking. No response. Just the trembling. Just those eyes half-lidded, unfocused, but open. Daniel looked at the harness. The canine insignia was still visible, stitched into one torn strap. Beneath it, a number tag. That wasn't a pet's collar. This dog had been trained, maybe even deployed. "What happened to you?" he whispered. The sky above had turned heavier, darker. Flakes of snow began to fall, light at first, then thicker. The forest quieted, as if holding its breath. Daniel stood, cradling the bundle of fur and harness to his chest. His clothes clung to him, drenched and freezing. But adrenaline pushed him forward. Each step toward the cabin felt distant, as if the world had tilted sideways, and only the need to save this dog kept gravity working in his favor. The puppy gave a tiny cough, a weak one, but it was sound. "That's it. That's good," Daniel whispered, tightening his grip. "You're a fighter." As he neared the porch, a single thought echoed louder than the rest. Why a K9? What was a trained working dog doing out here alone? Broken? Drowning? There would be time for questions, time for decisions, but not now. Now, the only thing that mattered was getting warm, getting dry, and keeping this fragile spark of life from going out. Daniel kicked the door open with his foot, rushed inside, and dropped to his knees by the fireplace. His fingers fumbled for the matches, striking 1, 2, 3, until the hearth roared to life, its glow catching the sheen on the puppy's wet fur. The dog didn't move, but it was still breathing. Daniel sat cross-legged, the dog in his lap, soaked to the bone but unshakable. "I don't know who you are," he whispered, "but you're not dying tonight." Outside, the snow thickened. The river ran on. And in that quiet little cabin, 2 lives, both half drowned, both forgotten by the world, found each other. The door slammed shut behind him with a dull thud, snow-laced wind curling through the gap just as Daniel shouldered it closed. The silence inside the cabin hit him like a second Waveno River roar. No wind, howl, just the aching stillness of wood and stone and the labored sound of a dog's breath against his chest. The little German shepherd pup was barely conscious. His small body, wrapped tight in Daniel's drenched flannel and jacket, gave the occasional weak shiver just enough to confirm he was still in the fight. Daniel moved fast but gentle. He knelt by the cold hearth and struck a match, his fingers trembling from the river's bite. It took 3 tries before the flame caught. With practiced hands, he added kindling, then logs. Within moments, the fire bloomed, casting flickering light and warmth across the cabin's timber walls. He laid the puppy down on a folded wool blanket, as close to the fire as safety allowed. Steam began to rise from the sodden coat as heat kissed damp fur. Daniel unwrapped the outer layer slowly, revealing the shivering mess beneath. The dog's breathing was shallow, uneven. "I've got you," Daniel said under his breath. "You're okay now. You're all right." He grabbed a dry towel from a nearby basket and began patting the dog down, careful not to startle him. Not that the pup reacted much at all. Only the faint flutter of his chest proved he hadn't given up. Daniel worked in slow, steady circles, drying each leg, behind the ears, under the belly. That's when he noticed it. Just beneath the matted fur on the dog's side, the edges of a scarnet, old, not fresh, but still raw around the stitching. There were more beneath the harness-thin lines, uniform, not the kind left by accident. Daniel's brow furrowed. His hands moved to the harness itself, cautiously undoing the remaining strap. It was military grade, though frayed and torn at the edges. Tactical webbing lined both sides, the Velcro patch on the back half ripped away. What remained was a faded insignia and a barely legible line of embroidery. K9 unit, code 4917. Daniel stared at it for a long moment. "You're not just any dog," he whispered. This pup had belonged to someone. Not a family, not a child. A handler, a partner, a mission. But now he was here, barely breathing on a cabin floor, in the middle of nowhere, abandoned or lost or worse. Daniel took a slow breath, the weight of old instincts settling on his shoulders again. He thought he'd left behind when he walked away from the job. But trauma recognizes its own. There was something in the dog's stillness that felt too familiar. The kind of stillness that follows a breaking point. Outside, snow had begun to fall harder. Thick flakes gathered on the window panes, muffling the outside world in a hush only winter could create. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, sending soft golden light over the rough floorboards. Daniel added another log, then returned to the pup. The towel had soaked through, so he replaced it with a thick fleece blanket, tucking the dog in snugly. He hovered a hand above the ribcage still, shallow, but now steady. Good. That was something. He sat beside him, back against the stone hearth, legs stretched out, dripping wet but numb to the cold. His eyes kept drifting back to the dog's face, mud-specked, fur clumped, ears slightly back. A flicker, one eye, barely open, caught his gaze for a breath. Just a sliver of amber. Daniel leaned in, not daring to speak. The eye closed again. He smiled faintly. "You saw me, didn't you?" He stayed that way for a long while, just sitting beside the pup in silence, watching the fire do its slow work. Eventually, when the shivering faded and warmth began to creep back into the room, he stood. He peeled off his soaked undershirt and grabbed a dry sweatshirt from a hook near the door. His jeans were still damp, but it would have to do. The only thing that mattered now was keeping that little heart beating. He grabbed a bowl from the kitchen, filled it with warm not hot water, and set it beside the dog. The pup didn't move. "Later," Daniel murmured. "We'll try later." He sat again, this time with a blanket draped around his shoulders, the fire crackling gently beside him. The dog had curled slightly in his sleep, one back paw twitching as though chasing something only he could see. Daniel watched, not just with curiosity, but with something older, something heavier. Recognition. He'd seen that kind of fight before, in people dragged from burning buildings, in teenagers pulled from flood zones, in veterans flown home with wounds no one else could see. He knew what survival looked like. And this little dog, whatever his name was, wherever he came from, had it buried inside him. A survivor's spirit. Quiet. Fragile. Unbroken. Daniel reached out and gently touched the dog's head, just between the ears. The fur was soft there, and still damp. "You're safe," he said softly. "I don't know who you belong to, or how you got here, but you're not alone now." The firelight danced across the room as the storm gathered outside. For the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel quite so alone either. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether this dog would recover, or if someone might come looking for him. But in that moment, sitting beside the fire, listening to shallow breaths rise and fall beneath the blanket, he felt something anchor inside him. A flicker of purpose. Maybe saving this dog was the first right thing he'd done in years. The snow came heavier now. Not a drift yet, but enough to blur the edges of the world into smears of white and gray. Tree limbs bowed slightly under the fresh weight. The old gravel road winding away from Daniel's cabin had begun to vanish under a thin film of frost. He didn't care. Inside the cab of his aging pickup truck, the heater fought to bring warmth into the air. The defroster squealed against the windshield, barely keeping up. On the passenger seat, wrapped in a towel and Daniel's fleece-lined jacket, the pup lay motionless. Only the rise and fall of his fragile ribs gave any sign that he was still here. Daniel kept glancing over every few seconds, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching out to steady the bundle when the truck jostled over a rut in the road. "Hang in there, buddy," he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to the dog or to himself. Almost there. He pushed the truck harder than he normally would on slick roads, but the thought of that little body going still that he hadn't gotten there in time was enough to drive the gas pedal deeper. The clinic wasn't much, just a small, weathered building on the edge of a two-stoplight town called Chestnut Hill. Daniel hadn't been there in over a year. He'd had no reason to. But the sign was still the same. Morrison Veterinary, Est. 1982. A painted image of a golden retriever wagged its tail next to the phone number. Daniel didn't park so much as slide to a stop, gravel skittering beneath the tires. He was out the door in seconds, scooping the pup into his arms, jacket and all. The cold bit his fingers, but the heat from the dog's small body, feverish in some places, frighteningly cold in others, kept him focused. He pushed through the door, bell chiming overhead. The woman at the reception desk, a middle-aged assistant with graying curls and a pen tucked behind her ear, stood immediately. "He needs help. Now." She didn't ask questions. She took one look at the dog in his arms and called down the hallway. "Dr. Morrison! Emergency!" Within seconds, an older man appeared, mid-70s, tall and wiry, with a permanent crease between his brows and the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much loss but still kept trying. "Bring him in," Dr. Morrison said, motioning Daniel through the door. They entered a small exam room where the walls were lined with framed photos of smiling pets and dusty shelves of medical supplies. The vet pulled on gloves, cleared the counter, and nodded toward the blanket. "Let's see what we've got." Daniel laid the pup down gently. "He was in the river," he said. "Freezing. Barely conscious. His voice caught. "I found him this morning." Dr. Morrison was already checking vitals, feeling along the ribs, touching each limb with precision. "He's dehydrated, severely underweight. Pup like this should have at least 10 more pounds on him. Pulse is faint, but there, breathing shallow. He's in early-stage hypothermia, but you may've pulled him out just in time." Daniel swallowed hard. "Is he going to make it?" The vet paused, placed a hand gently over the puppy's heart, waited. "He's a fighter, but we'll know more in a few hours. He'll need fluids, warmth, rest, and food. Real food. He's been without it for a while." Then his eyes flicked to something else, the torn harness, still clinging to the pup's midsection. He brushed aside the fabric to read the stitching. "K9 unit, code 4917. Morrison's expression changed. "Where did you say you found him again?" "About 4 miles out," Daniel replied. "Near the bend where the river forks north." The vet frowned. "That's remote country. You see any tracks? Any sign of another dog? A person? Anything?" "Nothing." Daniel shook his head. "He was alone, drowning." Morrison pulled a stool close, sighing heavily as he inspected the code again. "This isn't a pet harness. This is official grade. Police, military, border patrol maybe? You don't just find dogs like this in the woods." Daniel looked down at the limp figure. He could still see the scars beneath the pup's matted fur, the remnants of something violent, something organized. "You think someone dumped him?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know." Morrison's tone was measured. "But a trained K9 doesn't end up in that condition by accident." The air in the room thickened with implication. Daniel leaned closer, brushing a hand gently over the pup's head. One of the dog's ears twitched. That was the first real movement. "You saved more than a stray today," the vet said quietly. "This little guy, someone trained him to serve, and someone let him down." Daniel felt a knot tighten in his chest. Not for the first time, he thought of the people he hadn't been able to save, of the rescue calls that ended in silence. Not again. He cleared his throat. "What now?" Morrison stood, removing his gloves. "I'll give him fluids, monitor his temp. Get some nutrients into him. You can stay if you want." "I do." The vet nodded and stepped out, leaving the door open. Daniel pulled a chair closer, sat down beside the table, and laid his hand gently on the pup's back. The dog didn't move, but he didn't shy away either. "You're not going back to whatever left you out there," Daniel whispered. And for the first time, he meant it. The hours blurred, stitched together by the soft hum of medical equipment and the occasional metallic rattle of instruments being shifted on a nearby tray. Outside, the wind scraped across the siding of the small clinic like a warning that winter wasn't done yet. But inside the exam room, warmth held its ground. Dim light from a wall lamp spilled over the table, casting a faint amber glow across the worn harness and the dog's trembling form. Daniel hadn't moved. Not once. He sat rigid in the old vinyl chair beside the table, elbows on his knees, hands laced in front of him, as if praying, though he hadn't done that in years. His eyes stayed fixed on the German shepherd's small frame. Echo, though he didn't yet know that name, was still motionless save for shallow, rhythmic breaths. Every so often, Daniel whispered something. Not grand speeches or desperate pleas, just fragments of presence. "You're all right. You're not alone. You made it." The words weren't for comfort so much as connection threads cast across a chasm he couldn't quite see but deeply felt. And then, without warning, a moment. The dog stirred. Not fully, not even a twitch of a paw, but one eye opened, just a sliver, just enough, and it fixed on him. Daniel leaned forward, voice barely audible. "You're safe now." That single eye stayed on him, not fearful, not fully trusting either, but alert, a flicker of awareness where there had only been stillness before. He exhaled slowly, only now realizing he'd been holding his breath. Dr. Morrison returned just then, his presence quiet, like he knew not to disturb something sacred. He set down a fresh IV bag and checked the dog's vitals again. "His temp's up," he said, nodding approvingly. "Still low, but stable. That's progress." Daniel didn't respond right away. He just looked at the pup again, the eye now closed, as if the brief moment of connection had taken all the energy the dog could spare. The vet's voice softened. "You haven't left his side."
"No,"
Daniel murmured.
"didn't feel right to."
Morrison studied him for a second longer, then walked to the cabinet and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "These are care instructions. He's going to need more than food and water. There's trauma here, both physical and something else. Might take weeks." Daniel took the paper, eyes scanning the list. Hydration schedule, wound cleaning, muscle atrophy risk, soft foods only, keep warm at all times. "He's got a microchip?" Daniel asked. Morrison shook his head. "None that's scanned, which is odd for a K9. Daniel glanced toward the harness on the table's corner. Still torn, still bearing the imprint of duty. "So what happens now?" he asked quietly. Dr. Morrison gave a small shrug. "Well, if you're asking me, I'd say you two already decided." Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The vet nodded toward the dog. "Plenty of folks bring in strays and leave once they're patched up. You haven't moved in 3 hours. That pup opened his eye just now, and it wasn't because of me. He heard you." Daniel didn't answer, but something inside him shifted. Like a door that had been wedged shut for too long, finally gave way, if only an inch. Morrison packed up his tools and paused at the door. "You may have saved more than a dog today," he said, voice thoughtful. "But don't be surprised if it turns out that dog saved something in you, too." Daniel watched him go, the quiet settling in again like a blanket, freshly pulled over raw edges. He turned back to the shepherd, reached out carefully, and brushed a strand of damp fur from the dog's brow. "You heard him," Daniel whispered. "You're stuck with me now." No response. But he didn't need one. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was shared. And somehow, that meant everything. The storm outside had tapered into a steady hush, like nature itself was holding its breath. Snow no longer lashed, the window sill just fell, soft and constant, blanketing the earth in a stillness that made every sound inside the cabin feel sacred. Daniel stood in the kitchen, pouring hot broth into a chipped ceramic bowl. The aroma of bone and herbs curled upward into the air, mingling with the subtle scent of pine logs burning in the fireplace. He moved slowly, deliberately, part ritual, part reverence. Like if he made a sudden motion, the fragile thread connecting him to the creature in the corner would snap. In the far end of the cabin, where the shadows folded into the timber walls, lay the dog. Wrapped in layers of wool and an old army-issued blanket, the shepherd barely moved. The only sign of life was the slow rise and fall of his ribs. His head rested on a makeshift pillow, Daniel's old flannel jacket, still faintly carrying the scent of cedar, fire, and something more human. Daniel approached with the bowl cradled carefully in his hands. He crouched low, placing it just within reach of the dog's nose, and waited. No reaction. He expected that. He didn't need gratitude. Not yet. What he needed, what gnawed at him quietly, was understanding. The harness still hung on a hook by the door, torn but unmistakable. Black nylon with tactical stitching. A fading patch where K9 unit once blazed clear and proud. There were scars under the fur, barely visible now, but telling a story too cruel for guessing. Someone had trained this dog for service. Someone had fought beside him. And then what? Abandoned? Lost? Thrown away? Daniel sighed. "Who did this to you?" The dog didn't stir. He reached a hand forward, stopping just short of contact, unsure if touch would soothe or trigger something buried. His voice softened into something almost like a prayer. "You're here now. That's what matters." He adjusted the heating lamp, careful not to aim it too close, and added another log to the fire. Then he knelt again, this time settling on the wooden floor, cross-legged like he used to sit when he was teaching recruits how to stay grounded during chaos. "You need a name," he murmured. "Not just boy or pal. You've earned more than that." The dog's ears didn't flicker. His eyes stayed closed. Daniel tilted his head, thinking not just about what to call him, but about who he might be beneath all the silence and pain. A shadow, once part of something bigger. A presence that lingered even when everything else was gone. A voice, once strong, now reduced to memory. He looked at the shepherd again. Echo. The word fell into the cabin like a stone, into still water gentle, yet unmistakably there. Echo, he said again, more firmly now. That's your name. Still no movement. But Daniel didn't expect some magical reaction. Names weren't about recognition in the beginning, they were invitations. I don't know who gave you orders before, he continued, or what kind of world you came from. But from now on, you answer to kindness, to warmth, to second chances. Echo means you're still here, you're still heard. A long silence stretched between them, the kind that usually swallowed everything. But this time, it felt different. Like the name had landed not just on the shepherd's ears, but somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath the surface, where broken things waited quietly for someone to call them whole again. Daniel leaned back, his knees stiff from crouching. He looked at the bowl. A thin layer of broth had cooled slightly, untouched. But as he watched, the dog's nose twitched just once, barely a breath of movement. Daniel smiled, not triumphantly, but gently. You heard it, didn't you? He rose to his feet, crossed the room, and began cleaning up the counter. Each movement was purposeful, soaking the pot, wiping the surface, setting the kettle for tea. It wasn't just habit, it was grounding, because caring for something else meant returning to the rhythm of living again. Outside, the wind picked up slightly. A flurry pressed against the window like a ghost passing by. Daniel turned one last time before heading to bed. Echo was still curled in the same position, but something had changed. One paw had shifted forward, resting just shy of the bowl. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, beginnings don't come with fanfare. Sometimes, they arrive wrapped in wool, warmed by firelight, and whispered through the silence. The cabin was quiet that morning, quiet in the way only snow-covered forests could be. The hush outside seemed to soak into the wooden walls, muffling even the creaks in the floorboards. Inside, the fire had burned low, and Daniel shuffled around the kitchen, coaxing heat back into the hearth and warmth into the air. He reached for the iron pan hanging on a hook, planning to cook eggs and oats for himself, and perhaps see if Echo would sniff at the food again. But as he pulled it down, the handle slipped from his fingers and crashed against the stone floor. The sharp clang exploded through the cabin like gunfire. Instantly, Echo jolted from where he was lying. He didn't bark, he didn't whine. He flinched violently. His body snapped upright, ears flat, tail tucked tightly beneath him, eyes wide. Wild. Daniel froze. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just watched, holding his breath as Echo stood trembling, muscles taut. The faintest growl lodged deep in his throat knot, aggressive, but defensive, protective, wounded. Hey, Daniel's voice was soft, barely audible. It's okay, it's just the pan. But Echo's gaze wasn't with him anymore. It had drifted somewhere else, someplace far removed from this cabin, buried in time and memory. The shepherd didn't see a man in a flannel shirt. He saw something else, something burned into his instincts, forged under stress. Daniel slowly, carefully crouched down to lower his silhouette. Not to approach, just to ground the moment. You're safe, he said again, more gently this time. You're not there anymore. Echo stood frozen for a few more seconds before backing toward the corner where the old blanket lay. Not quite turning his back, not quite running, just retreating. That reaction wasn't normal. It wasn't just fear, it was trained fear. It was reflex. Daniel didn't need confirmation. He'd seen that kind of flinch before. In the Marines, in the eyes of young soldiers when a car backfired, in the way survivors ducked their heads when a helicopter passed overhead. He knew trauma when it blinked at him with glassy, canine eyes. Later that morning, when Daniel fetched his walking cane from beside the door, another small truth unraveled. The cane was old, but reliable. A temporary aid for a knee that never fully recovered from a fall during a storm the year before. It locked with a faint click when extended. As soon as that sound rang out, Echo stiffened. His head snapped toward Daniel, not in curiosity, but alarm. No growl this time, but his body language shifted. Chest low, breath shallow. The way one braces for pain, for command, or worse punishment. Daniel stopped mid-motion. He didn't bother locking the cane the rest of the way. Instead, he collapsed it slowly, holding it loosely by his side like a walking stick. He sat down on the armchair by the fire, eyes on Echo, heart heavy. "All right," he murmured. "So now we know." Echo turned his head slightly, but his eyes remained locked onto the cane. Not with fear exactly, but memory. And Daniel knew memories could haunt worse than fear, because memories couldn't be reasoned with. They lived in the bones. The clues were stacking. The ripped harness, the scars under the fur. The name K9 Unit, faded from where, not time. The way he didn't respond to affection but tracked every movement in the room like a soldier scanning for danger. Echo had come from a place where metal meant orders, where dropped pans meant urgency, where silence didn't mean peace, it meant waiting for the next noise to come louder. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on knees. He spoke low, slow, as if he were talking to a soldier on the edge. "I don't know who trained you, but I can guess what they used to enforce it." He sighed, the fire crackling softly in the quiet. "I won't pretend I can fix that, but I'm not here to control you either." Echo blinked. His body had relaxed just slightly, his paws no longer braced against the floor, though his breathing was still shallow. "I won't raise my voice. I won't use metal to make a point. And I won't expect you to trust me today," Daniel continued. "But I need you to know something, buddy." He paused. "You're not broken." The wind outside howled lightly against the window. Echo didn't move, but his ears rotated toward the sound, then back to Danielis, if weighing what he'd just heard. "You react because you survived," Daniel said, almost in a whisper. "That's not weakness. That's instinct. That's how you made it out of whatever hell you came from." He sat back in the chair and stayed there for a long time. No expectations, no gestures, just presence, letting Echo decide whether or not the silence could be trusted. Eventually, the dog lay down again, not fully stretched out, but no longer bracing. One paw extended slowly forward, resting just an inch closer to the fire than before. It was small, but it was progress. And in trauma, healing never announces itself like a miracle. It tiptoes. It tests the air. It flinches before it follows. Daniel watched Echo settle again. Eyes softer now, lids heavier. "Fear doesn't make you any less brave," he whispered, almost to himself. And somewhere in the stillness between the firelight and falling snow, a wounded soldier wrapped in fur let out the softest exhale and didn't flinch. The snow outside hadn't stopped, not truly. It would pause, settle, and then return in waves, like breath. Daniel had started to see the rhythm of it, the way the drifts gathered at the corners of the porch and softened the world into a quiet canvas. Inside the cabin, another kind of rhythm was forming, less visible, but just as deliberate. It began with the brushing. Daniel had found an old wooden-handled brush in the drawer beside the hearth. It had belonged to his previous dog, years before, when life was more structured and the world hadn't felt so tired. He turned it over in his hand the way a craftsman studies a tool before beginning a sculpture. He didn't walk toward Echo that first day. He simply sat on the floor, cross-legged, near the hearth, and ran the brush slowly over his own forearm, letting the soft bristles whisper against his skin. Echo watched from the far side of the room, head lifted, ears flicking, posture cautious. Daniel said nothing. The next morning he sat again with the brush. This time he held it out, let it rest against the floor. When Echo didn't move, Daniel nodded once, as if to say, "That's okay." By the fourth day, Echo had crept forward, not close enough to be touched, but no longer hiding. His gaze followed the brush with something more than wariness. It was memory, long dormant memory. Somewhere in that soldier's mind was a tether to gentleness. Daniel could see it, flickering like embers. "Just routine," Daniel murmured one morning, brushing slowly through the air. "That's all this is, just rhythm." Insert 4. He'd begun to narrate his actions not theatrically, not to fill the air, but to offer predictability. A gift in a world that had taught Echo to brace for the unexpected. "Water's going on the stove now," he'd say. Or, "I'm stepping outside just for wood. Be right back." Or sometimes, I'm not going to touch you, just moving past. Echo listened. He never acknowledged with a tail wag, or a lick, or anything so bold. But Daniel had learned that acknowledgement came in stillness, that when trauma no longer told the body to flee, that too was progress. Each morning, breakfast happened at the same time. A small portion of soft, warm chicken broth for Echo left near the fire and oatmeal for Daniel. The dishes were placed slowly, deliberately. Echo never ate while Daniel was watching, but the bowl was always empty by the time the fire burned low. The silences between them began to shift. They were no longer thick with tension, but softer. A quiet, shared not out of fear, but choice. Daniel didn't push. He didn't reach for trust. He earned it sideways, like coaxing sunlight into a shuttered room. The brushing eventually came. Not in a grand gesture, but one morning, Echo stepped forward and let Daniel rest the bristles lightly between his ears. The moment was brief, no more than 10 seconds before the shepherd pulled away, but Daniel didn't react. He didn't try to repeat it. He just whispered, "Good," and returned to his seat. That night, as the snow fell heavier than before, Daniel sat by the fire with a worn novel in his hands. He wasn't reading, just holding it, thinking about the way recovery never announced itself. He looked over at Echo, who now lay on the old quilt instead of curled against the wall. His body was less taut, his breathing slower. "You don't owe me anything," Daniel said quietly. "Not a bark, not a wag. Just show up when you can." Echo blinked slowly, not understanding the words but sensing their temperature, the calm in them, the invitation without command. Over the following days, the rituals grew. A tin bowl placed on the same rug each day. Water changed every morning, just after sunrise. Firewood stacked precisely. The sound of each log set down with care, not clatter. Daniel began talking during chores, not rambling, but enough to lay a gentle thread of familiarity. "Storm might last another day. Cabin'll hold, though. She always has. Or, used to be another dog here, old Buckley. You'd have liked him. He was grumpy as hell, too." Echo started to follow him with his eyes, occasionally with a step or two into the next room. He didn't seek touch, didn't beg or bark, but the space between them grew smaller, quieter, safer. Daniel never said it out loud, but he could feel it. The dog was watching everything, every movement, every tone, every ritual. Not as a threat, but as a map. As if Echo were rebuilding a world inside his mind, where people didn't shout and metal didn't snap and hands weren't for hurting. One evening, as the last light slipped behind the ridge, Daniel sat on the front step and watched the snow drift sideways across the trees. Echo stepped beside him, not close enough to touch, but just near enough that their silhouettes aligned against the gray. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. And in that silence, Daniel realized something. Healing didn't always look like progress. Sometimes, it looked like presence. Like two beings choosing to occupy the same quiet, without expectation or fear. He didn't know what had been done to Echo. He didn't know what commands had been etched into his bones, or who had let him go, or why. But he did know this. Whatever had broken him hadn't erased him. And day by day, in brushstrokes and warmed broth and wordless rituals, something was coming back. Not fast, not loudly, but surely. The seventh morning came with a hush so profound it felt sacred. Snow had blanketed the forest through the night, smoothing over the rough, frozen world into something new, something untouched. The wind had stilled. Even the birds, usually stirring before dawn, seemed to hold their breath. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the hearth was steady, a quiet pulse in the center of the room. Daniel stood near the door, lacing his boots with familiar care. His cane leaned against the wall, its metallic click avoided for Echo's sake. He didn't call out, didn't pat his leg or issue a command. He'd learned better. Echo didn't respond to orders. Not yet. Daniel just glanced over his shoulder as he pulled on his coat. Echo lay curled on the rug, head resting on his forepaws. His ears twitched once, registering the sound of the latch sliding open. His eyes flicked up golden and dark all at once. Daniel nodded once. "Just stepping out," he said, the same way he always did. "No pressure." The door creaked, and cold air swept in like a breath from another world. Daniel stepped outside into the morning silence. The snow was soft beneath his boots, untouched. His cane pressed small circles beside each footprint as he made his way down the porch steps. The air smelled clenpine and frost and faint wood smoke. He stopped after 5 steps and turned his head slightly, not enough to meet Echo's eyes, just enough to offer the choice. For a long time, nothing moved. Then, a soft rustle behind him. He turned his body fully now. The cabin door stood ajar. And there, in the threshold, stood Echo, just inside the frame. His paws pressed against the edge of the rug, nose lifted slightly to test the air. He wasn't wagging. He wasn't bounding out into freedom. But he was there, outside the safe perimeter of the hearth. That in itself was monumental. Daniel said nothing, just lowered his head slightly, acknowledging, not coaxing. Echo stepped onto the first wooden plank of the porch. It creaked faintly beneath his weight. He flinched, but didn't retreat. Daniel waited. A second step, then a pause, then pause meeting snow. His movements were slow, deliberate. Each placement of his foot seemed to test the world for safety. The snow reached up his legs, clinging to fur matted from days indoors. He blinked against the brightness. His breath fogged the air in short puffs. Daniel took 3 more steps ahead, into the clearing. He didn't turn around fully this time, just enough for Echo to know he was still there. Echo followed 3, maybe 4 paces, close enough that the sound of his steps merged with Daniel's, but still far enough to retreat if needed. They stood together, finally, beneath the arch of pine trees dusted in white. The forest didn't speak. It didn't need to. The hush of snow beneath paw and boot, the rising clouds of breath, the creak of ancient branches and the cold all of it was a kind of music, a kind of welcome. Echo paused, head low, ears flicked back. His body was taut not in fear, but awareness. He was watching the world again, not just surviving it. Daniel turned toward him, slowly, carefully. "You don't owe me anything," he said softly. "But you stepped out. That's yours." Echo didn't move, but his eyes didn't dart away, either. The world around them stretched vast and white, the forest holding secrets in the curve of every snowbank. But here, in this clearing, it was just the 2 of them, man and dog, each shaped by old wars, by silence, by the ache of trust too long denied. A crow called out from somewhere deeper in the trees, and Echo stiffened. His head turned sharply, muscles pulling taut as if waiting for a command, waiting for the next impact. Daniel saw it happen the way Echo's eyes searched for threat before realizing none would come. "It's just a bird," he said. "You're not being hunted anymore." Echo blinked slowly. His shoulders relaxed a fraction. Daniel crouched now slowly, knees groaning beneath him. His palm brushed the snow beside him. He didn't reach out, didn't close the distance. Instead, he simply whispered, "You made it outside. That's all. That's enough." For a moment, Echo stared. Then he took a slow, cautious step forward. Just one, but enough that the distance between them shrank not just in feet, but in something deeper, in the shared willingness to be seen. The wind picked up slightly, teasing through the trees, brushing snow from the branches in shimmering curtains. A few flakes caught in Echo's fur, melting against the lingering warmth of the cabin. Daniel stood again and turned back toward the porch. "Come if you want," he said, voice even. "Or stay. Either way, the fire's still going." He walked up the steps and slipped inside, leaving the door open just a little. Minutes passed. And then, quiet footsteps. Snow shaken off. A soft breath. Echo returned, not because he was told, but because he chose to. The sky had begun to thaw into early spring light, but the forest still carried winter in its bones. Daniel was chopping wood behind the cabin, his sleeves rolled up, sweat blooming across his collar despite the chill. Echo lay nearby, not too close, but close enough to watch, always watching. The dog no longer flinched at footfalls or the creak of the axe swinging down. He lay coiled in the snow-dusted grass, his eyes half-lidded, tracking every movement like a living radar. They'd settled into a rhythm. The man and the silent shadow behind him. Daniel had just split a knotty log when it happened. A sharp blare, harsh and sudden, ripped through the stillness. A car siren. Somewhere down the hill, Likely old McKinley's rusted pickup acting up again. The sound sliced through the pines, distorted and echoing. In a blink, Echo transformed. He didn't run, he didn't whine. He dropped, muscles locked, body low to the ground, tail stiff and straight behind him. His head swiveled left, then right, ears snapping forward in sharp synchrony. His breath came in shallow pulses, chest barely rising. One front paw inched forward without a sound. Claws retracted for stealth. Daniel froze mid-motion, axe still in hand. It was like watching a ghost wake up. Not a frightened animal, but something trained, efficient, conditioned. Echo's eyes weren't afraid. They were scanning, calculating. Daniel slowly set the axe down into the stump. "Echo," he said softly, not commanding, just present. No response. The dog remained in position, fully alert. The siren wailed once more, warbled, then died. A long silence followed, as if even the birds were waiting to see what would happen next. Echo remained crouched, but his ears twitched. A second passed, then another. Slowly, deliberately lifted his head, eyes narrowing toward the tree line as if expecting movement. Daniel took one step closer, crunching snow beneath his boots. "It's just McKinley's old truck," he murmured. Nothing more. Echo's tail gave a single twitch. His body was still rigid, but the tremor of adrenaline had begun to fade. His breathing slowed. One paw eased back beneath him. Daniel crouched nearby, not intruding, just offering ground. "That wasn't fear," he said, half to himself. "That was muscle memory." Echo finally looked at him. Really looked as if assessing threat level, then recognizing a different kind of presence. Daniel's eyes traced the old scar on Echo's left flank, the one partially hidden by fur now growing back. The ripped harness had been stitched with military-grade thread. The silent obedience. The readiness to act under stress. The refusal to vocalize, even in panic. "You were trained," Daniel whispered. "Hard." The wind rustled the branches above, letting in soft flickers of sunlight. Echo remained frozen, as if the earth beneath him might shift again. But his tail slowly lowered to a neutral line. He didn't break eye contact. Daniel's voice softened further. "It's not over, is it? Wherever you came from, it still lives in your bones." Another pause. Then, like a thawing glacier, Echo stood. Not slowly precisely, a clean rise from crouch to standing. Back legs first, shoulders squared, eyes scanning once more before finally relaxing his stance. It wasn't the movement of a stray. It was a soldier standing down. Daniel exhaled quietly, more moved than surprised. He'd known had felt it, but this moment clarified the truth. Echo wasn't just any abandoned dog. He was assigned, programmed, deployed, and somehow discarded. Daniel stood with him, careful not to make it a moment of dominance. He wasn't trying to claim territory, just share it. "You reacted to a siren," he said. "That means urban deployments. That means drills, response units, maybe bomb squad, maybe worse." He looked down at Echo. The dog's ears had settled now, but his gaze lingered on the horizon like it held unfinished business. Daniel swallowed. "Who trained you?" No answer. Of course not. But Echo stepped closer. No contact, no nudge, just proximity. An inch closer than he'd allowed before. Daniel didn't miss it. The forest returned to its regular rhythm wind in the trees, a bird's call, the distant thrum of a generator far downhill. But something had shifted. A layer peeled back. A flash of the past had broken through. And instead of retreating into silence or terror, Echo had managed it. A controlled reaction. Not buried. Just channeled. Daniel let out a long breath and knelt beside the dog. "I don't know who left you out there, or why," he said. "But you're not property anymore. You're not an asset." He paused, eyes steady. "You're Echo. And this forest doesn't expect anything from you." Echo blinked once. The space between them no longer felt tentative. It felt shared. And though the siren had long since faded, its echo still lingered not as a threat, but as a reminder. Some ghosts don't need to be chased away. They just need to be seen and named. It was the kind of morning that arrived without warning, gray, breathless, and quiet as confession. The forest outside the cabin held its breath beneath a sky smothered in low clouds. Snowmelt dripped from the roof like a ticking clock. Inside, Daniel sat at the work table near the window, shoulders hunched, hands still. In front of him lay the torn harness. It hadn't moved since the day Echo collapsed in the snow. Daniel had tucked it into the bottom drawer of a wooden chest, as if locking it away could somehow stall the questions it carried. But they lingered every time Echo twitched in his sleep. Every time he flinched at the sound of a latch. Every time silence weighed too heavily between them. Today, Daniel couldn't look away. The harness was military-grade sturdy, weather-worn, but unmistakable in its design. The outer fabric was a blend of canvas and ballistic nylon, faded to the color of ash. One buckle was missing. The other still snapped shut with a reluctant click, stiff from exposure. Dirt clung to the seams like old blood. But Daniel could feel something beneath it, intention, history, routine. This wasn't a pet's gear. This was issued, worn, trusted. He turned it over in his hands, fingers moving carefully across the material. And there, just behind a padded lining, was a tag. Small, waterproof, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. His fingers froze, then unhooked it with deliberate care. It was a polymer rectangle, sealed airtight, faint lettering stamped across one side in military sans serif. Unit 5, B, K9 code, 4917. Do not remove federal property. Daniel stared at it. The weight of those words didn't lie in their length, it was in what they withheld. There was no name, no agency, no location, just a unit, a number, an identity reduced to code. He ran his thumb across the edge of the tag, then placed it flat on the table beside the harness. His jaw tensed. He looked toward the fireplace where Echo lay curled on his side, eyes half-lidded but still alert. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm. The firelight caught in the faint silver along his muzzle, making him look older than he was. Daniel whispered the number to himself. 4917. Echo's ears flicked slightly. Not a reaction. Not really. But Daniel felt something shift in the room, or maybe inside himself. He leaned back, reached for his old notebook, the one with pages curled from damp air and corners stained by coffee. He opened to a blank sheet, wrote the number down slowly, and underlined it twice. Then paused. Did he want to know? It was a question with thorns. Because if he followed that trail unit designation, military procurement, deployment record, she might learn who Echo had once belonged to. He might learn what Echo had been used for, what he had been exposed to, and why he'd been left behind. But he might also learn something else, something worse. That Echo wasn't just forgotten. He was discarded. Daniel exhaled through his nose, slow and quiet. He glanced back down at the harness, then toward the dog by the fire. Echo hadn't moved. There was no collar, no chip, no trace of civilian life. Just scars and reflexes and a silence deeper than instinct. Daniel reached into the harness's inner lining again, fingertips brushing across a frayed corner. Tucked there was a faded thread of paracord knotted, stained. Some kind of marker? A signal? Or a memento? He let it fall back into place. Whatever life Echo had lived before that blizzard, it wasn't made for a family. It was made for orders, for missions, for danger, with no explanation. Daniel rose from his chair, crossing the small room with the tag still in hand. He stopped at the fire, crouched low, and let the soft heat brush across his arms. He looked at Echo. "This was yours," he murmured, showing him the tag. "Know what it says?" Echo blinked. Daniel nodded as if the silence meant yes. He set the tag down gently beside the dog knot, forcing it on him, not expecting a response, just placing it there. Like returning something that had always belonged. Echo didn't move, but his eyes locked onto the tag for a long, still moment. Then, slowly, his gaze lifted to Daniel. There was no recognition in the usual sense. Just presence, just shared space. Daniel sat beside him. "I don't know what Unit 5B did. I don't know what you saw, or who gave the orders. Maybe someday I'll ask, maybe not." He leaned back against the log wall, eyes on the fire. "But I do know this," he said. "You're not 4917 here." A pause. You're not a number. You're not a file. You're not expendable. His voice dropped, soft as a breath. You're Echo. Outside, a crow called once, then went quiet. Snow shifted from branches in a slow, hushed cascade. Daniel stayed on the floor for a long while. He didn't move when his back began to ache. He didn't shift when Echo's paw stretched out slightly toward the tag resting just near it, not touching. It wasn't a gesture of ownership. It was acknowledgement. By nightfall, Daniel had wrapped the harness in a soft cloth and placed it in a wooden box beside the hearth, not buried, not hidden, just kept, for memory, for someday, for when Echo was ready if he ever was. It was just past 2 a.m. when the growl began, low, guttural, and barely audible like thunder rolling far off in a canyon you can't see. Daniel stirred in his sleep, brows furrowing beneath the thin sheen of sweat clinging to his forehead. He hadn't turned the heat up. The fire had burned low to embers, but the air felt heavy, charged. Another growl, this time louder, uneasy, sharp in the chest. Daniel's eyes opened. The cabin was dim, lit only by the flickering orange glow of what remained in the hearth. Shadows danced on the log walls, like distant memories, trying to claw their way out. Echo was across the room, legs twitching, ears back, breathing rapid. The growl had become a whine now, low and strained. Echo. Daniel sat up slowly, not making any sudden sounds. Hey, easy. But Echo didn't wake. His paws kicked at nothing. His body jolted once, then twice. A strangled sound half bark, half cry rose from his throat before he snapped upright with a gasp, eyes wild, chest heaving. Daniel didn't move. Echo stood frozen, staring at a space in the dark only he could see. The growl was gone, replaced by a kind of stillness that didn't settle. It hovered tense, hollow, his tail stiff, his shoulders locked, muscles wired as if waiting for gunfire. Hey, Daniel whispered again, this time gentler. It's okay. Echo's eyes darted toward him. Recognition came slow, but it came. Daniel didn't reach for him. Instead, he pulled the old quilt tighter around his legs and patted the floor beside his bedroll. You want to come here, bud? Echo didn't move right away. Then, cautiously, he crossed the floor. His movements were quiet but not soft-like, someone trained to walk without sound, not without pain. He sat 2 feet from Daniel, watching, still breathing hard. Daniel met his gaze. Nightmares? Silence. The fire popped once, and Echo flinched. Daniel looked into the flames, then back to the dog whose history he couldn't touch. Only scents-like smoke that lingers after something's burned too long. You're not the only one, he murmured. He reached for the kettle by the hearth, still half warm from before bedtime, and poured a little hot water into the metal bowl, just enough for comfort. Steam rose in faint curls. You ever dream of something so real you wake up tasting the dust? Daniel asked, voice soft like someone talking to themselves, but pointed enough for an audience. Echo watched him, eyes no longer wide but searching. Daniel chuckled, without humor. I used to dream of sand, for years, couldn't shake it. He leaned back, resting his weight against the log wall, his legs stretching slowly. The old injury always barked this time of night, but he'd gotten used to that. I was on a mission once, Afghanistan. 16 clicks from base. Extraction went wrong, real wrong. Intel was garbage. We were trying to pull a medic unit out from a collapsed school, but we didn't know the second floor was rigged. A long pause. The kid elects me spotter. He was 23, just married. His wife sent him cookies every damn week. He had a photo of her taped inside his helmet. Daniel's throat caught. He swallowed. One step too far. That's all it took. The room held stillness now, a reverent kind. I pulled 3 out, but not him. Never found his body, just fragments. He didn't need to look at Echo to know he was listening. They gave me a medal for that. Can you believe it? For surviving. His voice cracked then, barely. And when I got home, my brother? He trailed off, closing his eyes. He didn't even make it 6 months. Daniel's jaw clenched. He rubbed a palm against his forehead, as if trying to scrub memory from bone. Overdose. Fentanyl. Said he was clean. Said he was proud of me. He exhaled. You and me, he said after a long while. We've both lost people, huh? Echo shifted closer. It wasn't a full approach, just a lean. Subtle, like the moment before a soldier hands you their weapon to not surrender. Just shared burden. Daniel looked at him. "You don't have to tell me," he whispered. "I already know." Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin walls. Not fierce, but steady. A reminder that the world turned regardless of pain, regardless of silence. Echo lay down beside him, then his head low, his breathing slower. The edge of his body brushed against Daniel's knee. Not a hug, not a plea, just contact. Daniel let his hand rest gently atop the dog's back. Not stroking, just being. The fur beneath his fingers was warm, slightly coarse, and alive. The fire shifted again, throwing fresh light onto the two figures folded together in the corner of a lonely wooden cabin. And in that flickering glow, for the first time, Daniel didn't feel like he was carrying it all alone. Neither did Echo. The snow had fallen overnight, thick and untouched, like a breath held in silence. By afternoon, the sky had lightened into a pale hush. The kind of cold that didn't bite, just settled gently over everything, as if trying to soften the world. Daniel stood at the edge of the meadow behind the cabin, boots crunching against the fresh powder. Echo padded a few steps ahead, alert but calm, nose low, tail still. The vast field stretched Openo tracks. No boundaries, just a white canvas. "It's all yours, buddy," Daniel said softly. Echo didn't move far. He circled once, ears twitching at some distant sound only he could hear, then sat, still watchful, always watchful. Daniel reached down and picked up a stick weathered and dry, its bark already curling. He weighed it in his hand, glanced at Echo. "What do you think? Too soon?" Echo gave no reply, but his eyes flicked to the stick. Daniel raised it slowly, made a light toss no farther than 10 feet. The stick landed with a muted thunk, sending up a puff of powder. Silence followed. Then Echo stood. He didn't bound, didn't leap. He walked. Straight and deliberate. Each step careful, calculated, but not fearful. He reached the stick, sniffed it, paused, and then, clumsily, almost awkwardly picked it up in his mouth. Daniel didn't breathe. Echo turned, trotted a few paces back, then dropped the stick at Daniel's feet. His tail gave one uncertain wag, then another, barely perceptible. Daniel laughed. It was quick, unguarded, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. "Well, I'll be damned." He crouched, knees protesting a little. "You still remember?" Echo tilted his head. Daniel clapped. Once. Echo's ears twitched at the sound. But he didn't flinch. He sat, watching Daniel, mouth slightly open, breath fogging the winter air. "Let's try again." Daniel tossed the stick a little farther, this time 15 feet, landing near a bush dressed in snow lace. Echo hesitated, then moved. This time, with more rhythm, less calculation. He reached it, picked it up, turned back. The motion was fluid, almost easy. Snow clung to the tips of his fur. His steps made clean trails across the whiteness. When he reached Daniel, he didn't drop the stick right away. He held it a second longer, as if weighing something unseen. Then softly he let go. Daniel took it, nodding. "That's it," he murmured. "That's what we do out here. We play." A gust of wind rolled through the trees lining the meadow, shaking loose a spray of snow that glittered briefly in the afternoon light. The sun, pale and half-veiled, shone just enough to paint the frost in gold. Echo stood still, nose lifted. His posture wasn't tense, it was attentive, curious. For the first time, Daniel saw no trace of fear in him. He threw the stick again, this time farther. Echo ran. Not at full speed, but enough that snow kicked behind him. His legs, once used to cold metal floors and clipped commands, now found something else momentum. He reached the stick, scooped it up, turned too fast, and skidded slightly. Daniel watched, heart caught somewhere between awe and ache. This small, ridiculous motion meant more than words could ever hold. Echo returned, panting lightly. His tail wagged again, this time with intention. And Daniel did what he hadn't dared to do before. He reached out and scratched just behind Echo's ear. Echo froze, but didn't pull away. Daniel's fingers stayed light, respectful. "That's right," he whispered. "You did good." The dog leaned barely, but enough. Joy, like warmth in winter, never comes in waves. It trickles. It tests. It waits to see if the space will hold it. That afternoon, it did. They played for 20 more minutes, no rules, no goals, just presence, just snow and movement, and two beings learning, awkwardly, how to trust something as fragile as happiness. Eventually, the cold began to settle into Daniel's joints. He tapped his leg once. "All right, buddy, let's head back." Echo didn't argue. He fell into step beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed as they walked. Their shadows stretched long and thin across the snow, side by side, like a memory finally willing to be remembered. Back at the cabin, Daniel opened the door. Echo paused on the threshold, looking back one last time at the meadow. Then, quietly, he stepped inside. Daniel shut the door behind them. Neither spoke. But in the silence, something real had begun. It was just past midnight when the first sound broke through. A long, low howl. Not a bark, not a cry, but something ancient threaded with distance, hunger, and winter. Daniel stirred in his chair by the fireplace, half asleep, a book splayed open in his lap. The flames had dimmed, casting the cabin in soft shadows. He blinked once, twice, then listened. There it was again. Closer now, another howl, then a second, higher pitch, a pair. He stood slowly, cane in hand, careful not to wake the embers too much. Across the room, Echo lay curled on the braided rug. His eyes were open. Wide open, his ears already rotated toward the door. Still, quiet, but not relaxed. "Coyotes," Daniel muttered, adjusting his balance. "Figures." He took the flashlight from the hook near the window. The snow had stopped falling earlier that evening, and outside the glass panes, the world shimmered under moonlight silver. Still, too perfect. Daniel made for the door. But Echo was faster. The dog rose in one smooth motion, quiet, efficient. And then he stepped in front of Daniel, body low, gaze fixed. "Easy," Daniel said, blinking down. "It's just noise, bud." But Echo didn't move, didn't growl, didn't bark. Just stood there between the door and Daniel. Breath controlled, shoulders squared, eyes locked on something Daniel couldn't yet see. Daniel hesitated, then opened the door gently. A gust of cold swept in, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine, ice, and something wilder. Feral. The flashlight beam cut through the dark. There, just beyond the edge of the woods, a shape. Small, but not small enough. Low to the ground. Golden eyes catching the light. Unmoving. Coyote. It stood at the tree line, head tilted, its own breath visible in the moon-chilled air. Not aggressive, not panicked, just watching. Echo took one slow step forward. His tail was low, straight, his head down, but his body was a line of coiled muscle and memory. Daniel lowered his flashlight. The coyote didn't move. Then so quietly it barely stirred the frost, Echo growled. Not loud, not threatening, but the kind of growl you didn't argue with. Deep, controlled. A warning born not of fear, but purpose. The coyote blinked, then turned, and disappeared into the trees without a sound. Echo remained at the threshold, watching, waiting. Only when the silence returned true, deep silence, did he exhale and step back. Daniel hadn't said a word. He just watched the shift in posture, the discipline in Echo's every move. No wasted motion, no chaos. Only instinct. The kind trained into a body until it became muscle memory, until it was a creed. He looked at. Echo really looked. The way the dog now stood beside him. Still silent, still alert, but calm. "You didn't forget," Daniel whispered. Echo turned to him, briefly, and then, quietly, sat. Daniel crouched, groaning softly from the stiffness, and rested one hand on Echo's shoulder. "You knew what to do." Echo didn't react. But he didn't pull away either. Daniel didn't need a wagging tail. Not tonight. He understood. This dog, this ghost in fur, was still a guardian. Still wired to protect, even after all that had been done to him. Even after the leash had been cut and the world had gone quiet. The embers behind them cracked faintly. Daniel stood again, nodding to himself. He left the door ajar for a few more seconds, watching the tree line. But the coyote was gone. The forest, like Echo, had returned to stillness. He closed the door gently, locking it with a soft click. The cabin was warm again, safe. Inside, Echo returned to his place by the hearth without command, without praise. He simply lay down. But he didn't curl in on himself this time. He stretched out, one paw forward, head resting gently across it, eyes half-lidded. Daniel added a log to the fire. The flames rose slowly, painting the walls in soft amber light. He sat back in his chair, looking at Econaut with pity this time, but with something deeper, respect. "You've still got it," he said softly, "and I think you always will." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the eaves. But inside the cabin, the night was held, not by walls or locks, but by a dog who remembered what it meant to guard something worth guarding, and the man learning slow that maybe he was worth that protection after all. The wind rattled the window panes that morning, a stubborn whistle threading through the eaves like a memory refusing to die. Daniel sat at the table with his coffee gone cold. Echo was by the fire again, his body still, chest rising in slow rhythm. But his eyes were open, as they always were, scanning, watching, quietly assessing the world like it might fracture at any moment. In Daniel's hand was the harness, weathered, scuffed, its once black nylon now dulled to a charcoal gray. A jagged tear ran down one side, like it had been caught or ripped, maybe on a fence, maybe during something worse. He turned it over again, fingers tracing the edge of the weatherproof tag tucked discreetly under a strap. Unit 5B, Canine Code 4917. He'd stared at those words every day for nearly a week. Not just stared, questioned, wrestled, turned the decision over in his mind until it bled at the corners. Who were they? What had happened to this dog? And more importantly, did he want to know? But that morning, something shifted. Not in Echo, in him. He powered up the old laptop, waited for the signal booster to crawl toward one bar of shaky mountain internet, then opened a secure message draft. The name at the top felt heavy to type: Scott Travers, retired K-9 captain, Mesa PD. They hadn't spoken in years. The last time had been at Daniel's brother's memorial. Scott had driven 4 hours just to sit in the back row, never saying a word. But when Daniel had gone to leave, Scott had pressed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "We don't lose dogs. We lose men pretending they never needed them." Now, Daniel found himself typing the subject line with shaking fingers. Need info. Unit 5B, K9, 4917. He didn't add much, just a photo of the tag. A note. Found him up north. No tags, no chip. He's not in good shape. And then he sat back and waited. The reply came at 2:41 p.m. No greeting, no fluff, just the truth, laid bare like a field report. 4917 was Echo, male German Shepherd, assigned to handler Luis Mendez. Tactical unit under Joint DEA, PD operation, Cartel Sting, Arizona border sector. The 2nd of March, 2021. Echo went missing during breach. Mendez presumed Kia. Echo declared MIA. Case closed after 48 hours. Daniel stared at the screen. His stomach knotted. He read it again, and then a third time. He felt the fire across the room, the way it warmed the side of his face, but couldn't pull his attention from the glow of those words. Cartel Sting. Presumed Kia. Declared MIA. Case closed. He looked up. Echo was awake now, head lifted slightly, eyes on Daniel as if he'd heard something beneath the silence. Something stirring. Daniel whispered, "Luis Mendez was your handler." Echo didn't move, didn't blink, but his tail gave a single, almost imperceptible twitch. It wasn't understanding. It was recognition. A name that lived somewhere deep, buried beneath command tones and combat drills and the impossible things dogs were asked to carry. Daniel closed the laptop slowly, the air in the cabin suddenly heavier. So, there it was. The law etched in that email. The paper trail. The bureaucratic closure. And yet, closure felt like the wrong word. This dog hadn't wandered off from a backyard. He hadn't run scared. He'd survived something, and someone had left him behind. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the table, pressing his palms together beneath his chin. The right thing, the legal thing, would be to notify someone, turn Echo in, let the agency take over, let the system finish the work it had abandoned. But in the stillness, Daniel heard another voice, one that didn't come from logic or duty or policy. It came from memory, from grief, from standing in a hospital room after his brother's overdose, watching machines do the breathing for him, and hearing a detective say, "You should have reported sooner." Sometimes the system was late, and sometimes the system was wrong. Daniel stood, walked to the fireplace, and knelt beside Echo. The dog didn't move as Daniel reached out, fingers brushing his fur gently. "You don't have to go back," he said softly. "Whatever you ran from, whoever let you go, that's not who you are now." Echo blinked, and then, almost hesitantly, he leaned in just, slightly letting his weight rest against Daniel's leg. Not surrender, not trust, but something in between. "I'm not sending you back," Daniel whispered. "Not yet. Not like this." That night, Daniel erased the email, not to hide it, but to let it go. Echo had been a number once, but now, in this small cabin tucked in the spine of winter, he was something more. A survivor. A ghost made flesh. And maybe, just maybe, a second chance neither of them saw coming. The sky wore a hushed gray that morning, like the clouds were holding their breath. Snow had melted just enough for the trails to reveal themselves, again veins of damp earth winding through the woods. Daniel stood by the porch, slinging a blanket over one shoulder, thermos in hand. "Come on," he said gently, glancing back. Echo stood just inside the door, ears half up, head tilted. Daniel didn't repeat himself. Instead, he started walking. The path to the river was familiar now, even in the changing seasons. Bare trees arched overhead like quiet sentinels, branches clicking gently in the wind. The air smelled like thaw and pine bark, like earth waking up beneath layers of sleep. Daniel glanced back once. Echo was following, a few paces behind, not tentative but watchful. Their steps fell into rhythm, not as man and pet, not as handler and dog bud, as two things that had once been trained to move in silence and were only now learning how to exist in stillness. It wasn't far, just under a mile, but Daniel felt the shift long before they reached it. The river's voice filtered in first low, steady, ancient. Then the clearing, then the water itself. A ribbon of memory, flowing as it had before, only slightly swollen with melt and time. Daniel stopped. Echo stopped behind him. But then something changed. The dog's posture stiffened. Ears flicked back. Shoulders dropped low. Then he froze entirely. One paw lifted mid-step and held there, trembling. It wasn't fear in the human sense. It was memory crashing through instinct, whatever lived in his nervous system like a ghost refusing to leave. Daniel didn't move forward, didn't coax or plead. Instead, he stepped aside and laid the blanket on a dry patch of moss beneath a cedar. Saturday, down cross-legged, opened the thermos and poured coffee into the lid. He spoke without looking up. "We don't have to go back all at once." Echo didn't come closer, didn't sit. He just stood there, rigid, every breath shallow. Daniel waited, sipped, listened to the river. The moment stretched. Wind passed through the trees above them like a lullaby for no one in particular. And still, Echo didn't move. That's when Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the smooth stone he'd picked up weeks ago. Flat, dark, shaped like a dog's ear, curved perfectly at one edge. He rolled it between his fingers before tossing it gently toward the riverbank. It landed with a soft thunk in the leaves. Not a command, not a test, just a sound. Echo's ears perked. His muscles didn't relax, but his eyes shifted toward the sound tracking, measuring. Another few minutes passed. Then, carefully, Daniel reached into his pack again and pulled out a small, crinkled paper bag. Inside were bits of cooked chicken, Echo's favorite. He laid one on the blanket beside him. Didn't speak, didn't pat the ground. Just let it sit there, like an invitation with no deadline. Echo's tail didn't wag. But he lowered his lifted paw, set it down, took one cautious step forward, then another, and another, until he was standing a few feet from Daniel, close enough to smell the offering but not close enough to touch. Daniel smiled slightly. "That's close enough for today." They stayed like that for a while. Two souls by a river, not looking to conquer the past, just learning how to sit beside it without breaking. Eventually, Echo circled once and laid down still, not on the blanket, but just near enough that his flank brushed the edge of Daniel's coat. His head rested on his paws, eyes never leaving the current. The river moved on, like it always did. Indifferent, patient, forgiving. Daniel watched it too, remembering the first time he'd come here after Mason died, how he'd sat on that exact same moss patch and thrown rocks until his fingers bled. Grief hadn't left, but it had changed shape. And now, maybe, he wasn't the only one carrying it. He looked at Echo. The dog's eyes were half-lidded, not asleep, but not guarded either. There was a quiet inside him now. Not the silence of trauma. The silence of trying. Daniel exhaled. Soft, long, real. They stayed by the river until the shadows turned blue and the cold began to creep in again. As they stood to leave, Echo didn't wait to be called. He rose on his own and walked beside Daniel, not behind, not ahead. Just there. A companion. A survivor. A dog who didn't need to face it all at once, just a little more than yesterday. The storm moved in with no warning. It came like a silent curtain, first the wind, then the thick flakes, falling sideways in sheets. By late afternoon, the forest was buried in white. The cabin groaned beneath a weight of snow settling on its roof, and the windows wore a frost so thick it blurred the trees beyond into ghosts. Daniel had lit the fireplace early, tossing in extra logs like muscle memory. His hands moved, but his focus drifted. He'd been off all morning sluggish, skin pale, eyes glassy. At first, he'd chalked it up to the cold or maybe just poor sleep, but by nightfall, something deeper was unraveling beneath his ribs. Echo had noticed it hours earlier. The dog's pacing had grown steady, alert not, anxious, not panicked, just watching. By 7 p.m., the power cut out. Lights snapped dark. The hum of the heater died. Only the fireplace held the room, its orange light flickering against the wooden walls like a heartbeat. Daniel stood up from the couch, reaching for his flashlight. He didn't make it. His knees buckled. The flashlight rolled from his hand and thudded against the floor. Echo's head snapped up. He was across the room before Daniel hit the ground. It wasn't a crash, more like a slow fold. A tree finally surrendering after years of leaning. Daniel lay on his side, one arm curled beneath him, the other trembling against the hardwood. His lips moved, but no words formed. Sweat beaded across his forehead despite the cold. Echo circled, then dropped beside him, nudging his face. Nothing. The dog licked his cheek twice, 3 times, then pawed his shoulder gently, as if testing the boundary between stillness and sleep. Still no response. That's when Echo backed up and let out a single, deep-throated bark. Nothing moved. No reply. He tried again. Louder. Sharper. Still nothing. So he howled. A sound that hadn't left his throat in years, not in training, not in fear, not even in the night terrors that sometimes jolted him upright in the dark. But now it came out raw, ancient, primal. The sound of calling for help when there were no words to use. He howled again and again. Outside, snow clawed at the windows. Inside, Echo stood rigid, ears twitching, gaze flicking from Daniel to the door and back. Then footsteps, distant, crunching across the snow. A flashlight beam sliced through the dark, then a voice. "Daniel?" It was Leah from 2 cabins over. She'd come to check on the generator when she heard the howling. She pounded on the door, then forced it open when no one answered, and froze when she saw Daniel collapsed on the floor and Echo standing guard beside him. The dog didn't lunga, didn't growl. He stepped back just enough to let her through. Leah dropped to her knees. "Oh my God, Daniel, can you hear me?" Daniel's eyes fluttered. His lips were tinged blue. She grabbed her phono service. "Shit." Her hands moved fast, checking his pulse, muttering to herself. Echo hovered behind her, tail stiff, eyes locked on Daniel's shallow breathing. "Low blood sugar has to be. Or worse." She looked around. Where does he keep anything? Medicine? Echo darted toward the kitchen and barked once. She followed. The cabinets were mostly canned goods, coffee, jerky, nothing useful. She ran back. I'm gonna drive, she muttered. If I can get through the snow. Leah wrapped Daniel in 2 blankets, pulled on his boots, then looked at Echo. You stay with him, don't let him fall asleep again, okay? Echo stared back, didn't blink, didn't move, just watched. Then she was gone door slamming behind her, headlights disappearing into the storm. 15 minutes passed. Echo sat, unwavering, beside Daniel's body. Every few seconds he nudged him, sometimes a paw, sometimes just his nose resting briefly against Daniel's chest, listening for the breath. The fire crackled, casting warm shadows over the dog's fur. Sirens, muffled through snow, then closer, then piercing. Red and white lights bled through the trees. 2 EMTs burst through the door moments later, Leah behind them, breathless, soaked, unresponsive. Hypoglycemia, she gasped. No known diagnosis, collapsed around 7. The medics worked fast-checking vitals, inserting IV glucose, wrapping Daniel tight as they lifted him onto a gurney. Echo tried to climb in with him. One of the medics raised a hand. Whoa, hold him back. Leah stopped them. Number let him. He saved him. They paused. Echo stepped up beside the gurney, resting his chin on Daniel's chest. Only for a second. Then he backed down and sat near the door, as if giving permission to leave now. As if his part was done. Daniel stirred just as they were wheeling him out, eyes fluttering, lips forming a shape Leah could almost read. Echo. She looked at the dog. I'll bring him, she promised. The medics nodded. They drove off into the storm, leaving behind a flickering fire, a spilled flashlight, and the shape of a dog who had remembered, in the moment it mattered most, what it meant to protect. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the IV machine and the occasional muffled footsteps from the corridor outside. Pale light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. The storm had passed overnight, leaving a gray blanket of snow covering the world beyond the window, serene and cold. Daniel lay propped up slightly in the bed, pale but stable, an oxygen tube resting beneath his nose, the color returning slowly to his cheeks. His eyelids fluttered open, heavy with sleep and the hangover of emergency. The world felt distant, fuzzy but real. The ceiling tiles above him were unfamiliar. The antiseptic scent in the air made his stomach turn. He blinked a few times before his gaze drifted to the chair beside his bed. Echo was there, curled neatly but awake, ears perked. The moment their eyes met, Echo stood, walked over to the bedside, and rested his chin gently against Daniel's forearm, careful not to jostle the IV line. His body was still tense, as if he hadn't relaxed since the moment Daniel collapsed. Daniel's lips twitched upward, in a soft, disbelieving smile. Well, look who didn't quit on me. His voice was gravelly, dry. Echo let out a quiet breath through his nose. His eyes, usually alert and scanning, held steady on Daniel's face as if confirming, "You're still here." A nurse entered. A warm, middle-aged woman with dark braids and a badge that read Nadine. She carried a clipboard in one hand, a gentle confidence in the other. "Well," she said, smiling when she saw him awake. "Look who decided to rejoin the world." Daniel nodded slowly, voice hoarse. "Where am I?" "Timber Ridge General. You were brought in last night. Hypoglycemia, induced seizure, undiagnosed type 1 diabetes based on your labs." She checked the chart. "You're lucky someone found you in time." He shifted slightly. "Someone?" She pointed toward Echo, who was now sitting upright again, eyes watching her but unmoving. Daniel exhaled. "Of course," he murmured, voice low. Then, after a pause, "Funny, isn't it?" Nadine looked up from her clipboard. "What's that?" He turned his head toward the dog. "I thought I saved him. Pulled him out of that river, took him in, gave him a home." His hand trembled slightly as he reached to scratch behind Echo's ear. The dog leaned into it. "But turns out," Daniel continued, his voice breaking just a touch, "he saved me." Nadine's smile was soft. She walked over, adjusted his blankets. "Sometimes," she said gently, "that's the deal." Daniel blinked. She met his eyes. "You think you're rescuing them?" "But they're just waiting for their turn to return the favor." The truth in her words hit harder than expected. It settled in his chest not like a blow, but like a realization that had been trying to find its way out for months. Echo hadn't just saved his life last night. He had shown Daniel what it meant to be seen, even in silence, to be protected, even without asking, to matter still. He closed his eyes briefly, a tear slipping down his temple, unnoticed by anyone but the dog, who licked it away before it dried. The nurse stepped back, giving him space. "You'll need insulin going forward," she added softly. "We'll get you trained up before discharge. But for no rest, you're stable." He nodded. "Thank you." She gestured to Echo. "He's been here all night. Wouldn't leave. Technically animals aren't allowed, but when the EMTs explained, well," she grinned. "Let's just say the staff voted. He stays." Daniel chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Good. I think I need him more than I thought." Ugh. Nadine walked to the door, but paused before leaving. "Sometimes," she said again, her tone light but firm, "the ones who are most broken know best how to hold others together." And then she was gone. The door clicked softly shut. Daniel lay there, looking at the ceiling for a long while. The quiet settled in again, but it wasn't empty. It was full of understanding, of survival, of second chances written in paw prints and scars. He looked back down at Echo, who had returned to the chair, head resting on folded paws. "Thank you," he whispered. Echo didn't move, didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was something else entirely. A pact. Formed, not in words, but in breath, in instinct, in the unspoken understanding of two beings who had both been adrift until they weren't. Daniel closed his eyes again, knowing that when he woke next, Echo would still be there. Not out of duty, but out of choice. And that changed everything. The first warm winds of spring rolled across the valley like a long-awaited breath. After months of snow, silent days, and nights, huddled in firelight, the world outside had softened. Trees budded in quiet defiance of winter's hold, and the town of Pine Haven stirred awake like something cautiously remembering how to feel joy. Daniel stood beside his old pickup truck, parked at the edge of the local dog park, door open. He looked out over the wide fenced field, where dogs of every shape and size bounded across the grass in clumsy freedom. Laughter and casual chatter floated above the clinking of dog tags and the excited yelps of play. Echo stood stiffly beside him. The leash was loose in Daniel's hand, but the dog hadn't moved. His ears twitched with every bark, every shriek of a distant tennis ball machine. His body was a line of tension, shoulders raised, muscles alert beneath his coat. His eyes scanned the perimeter, nose working overtime. Daniel crouched beside him, fingers brushing behind Echo's ear. "You don't have to go far," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "We'll take it slow, just us." The dog didn't look at him, but gave a small exhale, sharp, uncertain. Daniel smiled, faintly. "That's what I thought." They stepped inside together. The moment the gate clicked shut behind them, Echo moved closer his shoulder, brushing Daniel's leg, almost like he was tethering himself to something solid. A golden retriever galloped past, tail a waving flag, followed by a child, laughing breathlessly. Echo froze. Daniel stopped too. He knelt again, gently placing his hand on Echo's chest. Felt the wild flutter of a heart not used to chaos anymore. "Hey, eyes on me." Echo slowly turned, gaze meeting Daniel's. "You're safe," Daniel said quietly. "With me, you're always safe." And that was enough. They moved together one small step at a time until they reached a quieter corner near the fence, shaded by a budding oak. Daniel pulled a faded tennis ball from his jacket pocket. Echo's eyes followed it, head tilted, uncertain. Daniel tossed it underhand across the grass. Not too far, just far enough. The ball bounced, rolled, came to rest beneath a patch of clover. For a second, Echo just stared. Then, something memory, instinct, trust nudged him forward. He trotted after it, awkward, hesitant, but he went. Daniel didn't call, just waited. Echo picked up the ball and turned back, tail twitching slightly. Then he ran, not like a sprinting police dog, but like a dog remembering how. His ears flopped a little as he moved, ball held awkwardly in his mouth. It was clumsy, imperfect, real. Daniel laughed not loudly, just enough that his voice carried. When Echo reached him, he dropped the ball at Daniel's feet and sat, chest heaving. Daniel crouched beside him, beaming. "That's my guy." He ruffled Echo's head. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes softer now, less guarded. A few people had begun to watch from nearby benches. A woman with a dachshund smiled. An older man with a border collie gave a slight nod. No one said a word. But something had shifted. Not in Echo, not yet, but in the space around them. The dog that had entered the park like a coiled spring now stood next to his human, waiting for the next throw, watching his every move. Daniel tossed the ball again, just a little farther this time. Echo chased it without hesitation, returned it quicker, tail wagging. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. A little boy came closer, his hand sticky with ice cream, eyes wide. He didn't get too close, just stood at the edge of the grass and asked, "Can I pet him?" Daniel looked at Echo, who had turned, watching the boy too. "He's not ready yet," Daniel said gently. The boy nodded solemnly. "Okay." Then, after a moment, "He looks like a good dog." Daniel's throat caught unexpectedly. "Yeah," he said softly. "He really is." The boy ran off. Echo came back again, ball in mouth, chest puffed slightly now, like something proud had clicked into place. Daniel let the leash drop entirely. People were still watching, but not out of fear. They saw something else now. A dog that didn't play like the others. Didn't bark or chase or tumble, but moved with purpose, with connection. Like every step was rooted in something deeper than command. Trust, gratitude, survival. Daniel sat on the grass, legs crossed. Echo dropped the ball, then laid beside him, body stretched long, head resting on Daniel's boot. For the first time in a long time, Daniel let himself just be. Among people, among laughter, among stories that didn't need to be told, because some were written in the way a dog chose to stay by your side in the open. No leash, no collar, just choice. And Daniel knew, without needing to say it, Echo had chosen him. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind that smelled of thawed earth and sun-warmed bark. Pine Haven's public park hummed with spring's return grills, hissing, children laughing, shoes thudding against trails once buried in snow. Near the pond, dragonflies skimmed the surface like living brushstrokes, and families laid out blankets on tender grass. Daniel sat on a bench not far from the water, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. Echo lay beside him, tail curled around his haunches, eyes half-lidded but never truly asleep. His ears still tracked everything, footsteps behind them, a shout from the swings, the flap of a frisbee cutting through air. Daniel had grown used to that quiet vigilance. It never left him, not in the cabin, not in the park. Echo was always watching. But this was the first time he'd seemed almost at peace. They had just finished a short walk, nothing too demanding. Echo still bore scars beneath his fur, and Daniel had learned to read the rhythm of what the dog could give. Some days were about trying. Some were just about breathing. Daniel looked across the park and spotted the same little boy from the dog park a week earlier, blonde hair, a neon green shirt, all elbows and knees. He was chasing a frisbee across the open field, giggling, unbothered by anything other than the flight path of plastic. Daniel smiled faintly. Then everything shifted. A scream tore through the warm air, sharp, maternal, and fractured. The boy had overshot his throw, and in the blind joy of the chase, he ran straight toward the pond's edge. The grass was slick from morning dew. His sneakers slipped. And just like Faith was in the water. It wasn't deep, a pond more than a lake, but deep enough to frighten, deep enough for a child to panic. There was a splash, flailing limbs, choking gasps, another scream, closer this time. Daniel's legs jolted forward instinctively, coffee falling from his hand. But Echo was already gone. No bark, no hesitation, just motion. A blur of black and tan slicing through the spring air. He bounded over a patch of brush and launched straight into the pond. The water exploded around him. For a moment, all Daniel saw was spray and ripples. Then movement. Echo surged toward the boy, who was now half submerged, arms flapping wildly, mouth open but drawing in water instead of sound. Echo reached him like he'd done it 100 times before. His jaws closed not hard, not cruel around the back of the boy's shirt. and with one strong, practiced pull, began dragging him to shore. The child coughed, cried, kicked, but Echo held firm. Each stroke purposeful, each movement precise. Daniel knelt at the water's edge as Echo reached the bank. He grabbed the boy, cradling the shivering form against his chest, hands shaking. The mother arrived, seconds later, face pale, lips trembling. She fell to her knees beside Daniel, her voice cracking through sobs as she clutched her son. Oh my God, thank you." Daniel barely heard her. He looked at Echo, soaked, breathing hard, chest rising and falling like a slow drum. Water clung to every inch of him, his fur flattened and matted, but his eyes were alert, watchful, steady. Just like that day must have been. Somewhere else, somewhere far worse. You remembered," Daniel whispered. Echo stood still, water dripping from his muzzle. Then he stepped forward, not to Daniel, but to the boy. He sniffed the child once, and gently licked the boy's cheek. The mother's sob turned into a wet laugh. The boy, still coughing, looked up at the dog and croaked, "He's like a superhero." Daniel swallowed hard. People had gathered now, drawn by the scream, the splash, the sudden miracle. One man clapped. Another whistled softly, but no one approached. They all stood back, respectful, somehow not of danger, but of grace. Daniel rose slowly, squeezing the mother's shoulder once before, stepping toward Echo. He crouched, brushing the dog's wet fur from his brow. "You didn't even think, did you?" he murmured. Echo leaned into the touch, just slightly. Daniel smiled through the shake in his chest. "You're not broken," he said, voice barely audible over the sound of water lapping at the shore.
You were never broken.
And adieu. And for the first time since the cabin, since the firelight, since the trembling by the river, Daniel believed it. The news broke quietly, the way spring sometimes arrives, not with fireworks, but with a thawed morning and a breeze that smells like new beginnings. It started with a phone call. Daniel was rinsing Echo's food bowl when the landline rang. He almost didn't answer. No one called that number anymore, but something about the timing made him dry his hands and pick up. "Mr. Whitaker?" A woman's voice. Warm, clipped, professional. "Yes? My name's Karen Hill. I work with Channel 9, local affiliate. We heard about what happened at the park this weekend, with the boy and your dog. We were hoping to ask a few questions. Maybe even do a short piece." Daniel's eyes flicked toward Echo, who lay by the hearth, his head resting on crossed paws, ears perked at the sudden shift in tone. He thought of the water, of the way Echo had moved, not out of panic, but purpose. He didn't do it for cameras or credit. He did it because it was who he was. "I'm not really interested in interviews," Daniel said cautiously. "I understand," Karen replied gently, "but the boy's mother gave us your name. She said your dog saved her son's life. That deserves to be shared." Daniel hesitated. "Only if Echo's the one they talk about," Karen chuckled. "That's the plan." The next day, a young reporter and cameraman arrived just before noon. Daniel agreed to meet them at the park's same bench, same pond, because somehow it felt wrong to tell the story anywhere else. The segment ran that night. It was short, 2.5 minutes, but it struck a chord. They used footage from the pond, panning over the place where Echo had pulled the boy from the water. They interviewed the mother, who could barely hold back tears. "He didn't bark. He just ran," she said, voice shaking. "Like he knew. Like he'd done it before." "Oh." They cut to Daniel standing beside Echo, who sat calmly at his heel. "He's not just a dog," Daniel said, looking down at the shepherd. "He's a survivor. And sometimes, when you survive something, you don't forget how to help." The story aired at 6 p.m. By 7 o'clock, Daniel's mailbox had 3 handwritten notes from neighbors he barely knew. By morning, there were a dozen. Some came with dog treats, others with small drawings from children. Echo standing like a soldier, Echo with angel wings, Echo with a red cape. One child had written in purple crayon, "Echo the Brave." But it was the envelope postmarked from across town that Daniel opened with a slower hand. No return address, just a single line in careful cursive for Echo. Inside was a folded sheet of construction paper. On it, A crayon drawing of a German shepherd, big ears, kind eyes, and a little red heart floating above his head. Underneath, in blocky letters, "Thank you for saving my son. Love, Jona's mom." Daniel stared at the image for a long time. Not because of its artistry, though. It was beautiful in its own way. But because of its sincerity. There was no filter, no agenda, just gratitude, hand-drawn and sealed with hope. He walked back into the cabin and stood in front of the fireplace. Above it, the stone mantel had long sat empty. Daniel never hung pictures. No certificates, no reminders. Until now. He found an old frame tucked behind his bookshelf, dusted it off, and slid the drawing inside. Then, with careful hands, he mounted it to the center of the mantel, the shepherd with the red heart above his head. A boy's mother had called it love. Daniel called it truth. Echo patted over, curious. He sniffed the air, then looked up at the drawing. His tail wagged ounces low, deliberate. Daniel chuckled, kneeling beside him. "That's you, buddy." Echo leaned into him, resting his chin on Daniel's knee. "People see it now," Daniel murmured. "They see what I saw." Outside, the wind stirred the early buds of spring. Inside, a fire cracked gently in the hearth. The drawing above it danced in the flickering light, soft, red, and alive. Daniel looked down at his companion. "You were never just a dog." And Echo quiet, steady. Echo closed his eyes, as if he already knew. Tuesday afternoon held its breath. Sunlight melted through the pines. The radio murmured low, and Echo dozed under an open window while Daniel unpacked groceries. The landline rang 3 hesitant chimes before Daniel lifted the receiver. "Is this Daniel Whitaker?" Older male voice, southwestern drawl smoothed by years but threaded with hope. "This is Daniel. I'm Ray Donovan, retired K-Neil Devitt Task Force, Arizona. Greg Bell said you'd called months back about a harness tagged Echo 13. Daniel, did you find him?" Daniel's eyes drifted to the hearth. Echo's ears twitched even at rest. He was ready. "Yes," Daniel whispered. "He found me, really. He's safe." A shaky breath crossed the line, half prayer, half disbelief. "We assume the worst," Reed said. "Cartel sting went sideways on the border. Handler Tommy Dorsey died in the blast. Echo wouldn't leave him. The brass wrote them both off Kia. I kept telling myself no body, no proof." "Echo survived," Daniel replied. "He was starved, feral, quiet, but alive." Reed laughed, sorrowful and proud. "That dog's all heart." Echo lifted his head. Daniel moved the phone closer. "Hey there, soldier," Reed croaked. Echo froze. A low, rising whine slipped from his throat, a sound Daniel had never heard. Recognition. Reed wept openly now. "I trained him from 8 weeks old. Smartest partner I had. Too loyal for his own safety." They spoke for an hour, piecing timelines. Echo's last GPS ping. Daniel's river rescue. The slow rebuild. Before hanging up, Reed asked, voice trembling, Could I see him? Just once?" Daniel stroked Echo's ruff. "He'd like that, but we'll go slow." Emails exchanged. Reed promised training logs, vet records, puppy photos. Before goodbye, "Thank you for giving him a second chance," he said. Daniel glanced at the crayon drawing of Echo above the mantel heart hovering over a dog's head. Drawn by a boy Echo had saved. He smiled. "He gave me one too." 2 weeks later, a single knock sounded soft, deliberate, carrying weight. Daniel opened the door to a tall, square-shouldered man in a worn field coat, eyes the color of gunmetal clouds. Ray Donovan. Firm handshake, no flourish. Inside, Reed's gaze locked on the fireplace. Echo lay alert, tail still, assessing. Raid crouched, voice gone gentle. "Remember me, partner?" Echo rose, padded forward, one breath. Then he pressed his forehead to Reed's chest. The ex-U officer's shoulders shook as 16 months of doubt dissolved against fur. Coffee brewed, rain tapped the roof, and the 2 men traded stories. Reed described Echo's early brilliance, faking a limp to corner a suspect, guarding cold case evidence because he knew it mattered. Tommy Dorsey's pride in him, and the guilt Reed felt when command deemed the rubble too risky to search. "They never tried," he said, bitterness and grief entwined. "Echo deserved better." Daniel listened. When silence settled, Reed pulled a folded document from his coat. Turns out Echo was never officially declared Kayagist MIA. He's still on the Federal Registry. That gives him two paths. 1. Reactivation. Ceremonial work. Sento training. New handlers. Full honors. 2. Official retirement. Flag ceremony. Name etched on the unit wall. And legal transfer to any guardian Daniel names, including Daniel himself. I'm not here to take him, Reed stressed. But the choice should be his or as close as we can give a dog. Daniel stared at the fire. I thought I was saving him, he murmured. But he saved me. What if keeping him is just another cage? Reed shook his head. Echo's never stayed anywhere he didn't choose. Watch. Daniel called softly. Echo lifted his gaze, crossed the room, and leaned against Daniel's leg quiet. Certain. No leash could have said it clearer. Reed nodded. That's your answer now. But if it ever changes, the petition is here. He set the form on the coffee table. Before leaving, he knelt once more, forehead touching Echo's majesty. Still the best partner I ever had, he whispered. Boots crunched down the drive. Daniel slipped the petition behind the heart drawing knot. Discarded. Simply. At rest. A night rain left the forest bejeweled. Echo trotted ahead on the misty path, paws silent on damp needles. Daniel followed, petition still folded in his jacket, its weight equal parts question and reassurance. At the river, Echo halted. Cool, metal-luffinged air stirred a memory. He padded into the water until it brushed his chest, then sat tranquil in the current. Daniel watched reflection meet reflection, the lean war dog he'd once been and the steady guardian he was now. You choose every day, don't you? Daniel said. Echo's ears flicked. A distant burst of children's laughter drifted through the pines from a lakeside camp. Echo glanced back alert, protective, but turned again to the river, calm. Daniel unfolded the petition, fingered its crisp edge, then tore off the signature line. He tucked that shred in his pocket, set the rest afloat. Paper spiraled downstream, ink dissolving into thaw water. Echo stepped out, droplets sliding like discarded armor. He pressed against Daniel's knee. Daniel scratched behind his ears. Home, then, he said. The petition fragment would remain a reminder that choice lived in silence, that freedom sometimes meant no longer needing orders. Man and dog walked the hill path together, river murmuring approval behind them. The sun broke through, igniting pine tips in gold. Echo shook off the last beads of rain. Daniel breathed in damp earth and the faint metallic trace of yesterday's tears, then let both go. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Every step forward affirmed the same vow. Here, together, by choice. Daniel stood at the window with a mug of coffee in hand, steam coiling into the early light. Behind him, the fire had died to embers. Outside, the gravel path gleamed with a silver sheen, and beyond it, the river shimmered through gaps in the trees gentler now that spring had softened winter's grip. On the table behind him sat the folded petition form, unmoved, unopened since the day Reed left. He hadn't spoken of it since not to Echo, not to anyone, but it lived in the back of his thoughts like a door he wasn't ready to walk through. Echo had returned to his rhythms, patrolling the perimeter at dawn, sleeping by the hearth at dusk, and nudging Daniel's hand with his muzzle any time silence grew too long. But something in Echo had changed too. He no longer jolted at the sound of keys, no longer flinched at raised voices from the radio. And though he still woke sharply at 3 a.m., some ghost of his training still intact no longer paced the cabin. Instead, he'd quietly come to Daniel's bedside and lie down. Just lie there, not guarding, just being. That morning, Daniel walked to the table, picked up the form, and held it for a long while. There were no tears, no swelling music, just a breath, and the quiet certainty of knowing. He opened the drawer beneath the fireplace mantel, slid the form inside, and placed the boy's crayon drawing on top, then shut it with finality, not like slamming a door, but like sealing a chapter. A low chuff broke the silence behind him. Daniel turned. Echo stood there, tail still, ears forward, watching. You knew, didn't you? Daniel said, kneeling. Echo came forward and placed his head on Daniel's knee, a weight that had nothing to do with physical mass. It was permission. trust, a silent kind of vow. Daniel smiled, brushing his fingers through the thick fur behind Echo's ears. "You're home now," he whispered. "And this time, it's for good." They left the cabin around noon. The sun had burned through the clouds, casting a buttery glow on the path that led down to the river. Grass pushed stubbornly through the mud, and the air buzzed faintly with the first gnats of the season. Birds called overhead robins and finches like they were announcing some kind of rebirth. Daniel walked slow, hands in pockets. Echo padded beside him, his stride calm but alert, his nose twitching at every breeze. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. It was the same trail they had taken so many times over the winter, the same frozen bend, the same moss-covered rocks. But this time, it felt different. Less like a route of survival, and more like a path forward. When they reached the riverbank, Daniel sat on the old driftwood log that had become their unspoken meeting place with silence. Echo sat beside him, then gradually lay down, his flank pressed against Daniel's boots. The water moved slow and steady, reflecting the sky like a mirror softened by brushstrokes. "You know," Daniel said after a while, "when I first found you, I thought I was doing something brave, rescuing the broken dog at the edge of the woods, giving you a second chance." He smiled, but it was tinged with humility. "But it was you, wasn't it? You rescued me." Echo didn't move, just let out a slow exhale through his his version of a sigh Daniel had come to believe. Daniel looked ahead at the water. "I spent years thinking I had nothing left to give. After my brother died, after the deployments, I stopped believing in second chances. Then you showed up, silent, scarred, and somehow you saw through all of it." A crow called out across the river, its wings dark against the light. "I thought about sending you back," Daniel continued, "about letting them retire you properly. Honors, flags, a name on the wall. You earned all of that." He turned to Echo. "But I realized something." Echo looked up at him, eyes a calm amber. "You're not a medal to be shelved," Daniel said. "You're not a chapter to be closed." His voice cracked, just slightly. "You're my family." He reached out, laid a hand across Echo's chest, where the rhythm of his heart beat strong beneath thick fur. "You belong here, not because of what you did, but because of who you are." The breeze picked up, carrying the scent of wet bark and river stone. Echo pressed closer, resting his head against Daniel's leg again just like he had the night Reed came. Only this time Daniel didn't flinch from the weight. He leaned into it. For the first time, not as a man recovering, not as a rescuer, but as an equal. As someone who had been chosen without words, without condition. Later, as they headed back to the cabin, Echo trotted slightly ahead, tail relaxed, ears flicking at every squirrel rustle and breeze. Daniel followed with his hands in his pockets, and a kind of peace in his step that hadn't existed before. At the crest of the hill, Daniel stopped and turned to look back at the river. Then he looked down at Echo. "You ready to go home?" Echo looked up, then turned toward the cabin, walking ahead like he already knew the answer. And maybe, Daniel thought, he always had. The river finally thawed in May. Winter's mirror had become a living ribbon sunlight, glinting off minnows, branches trailing like fingertips, wildflowers clinging to the banks like stubborn sparks of color. Daniel Whitaker made the walk every morning, thermos in hand. Sometimes Echo padded beside him and pressed a scarred head against Daniel's knee before settling on their flat rock. Sometimes he stayed behind. Today, he was already wading ears forward, nose twitching at the scent of snowmelt. But Echo didn't sit. He stood at the edge, body taut, listening to a language older than commands. Daniel followed his gaze and held his breath. One deliberate step, then another. Echo waited in chest dupe, paused, and without a tremor rolled. A silver spray erupted. He did it again, front paws slapping sunlight, tail slicing crescents through the water. The sound that burst from his throat wasn't a bark of alarm. It was laughter. Daniel's own laugh cracked loose, rusty but real. "You goof!" he shouted. Echo bounded ashore and barreled into him, knocking the thermos into grass and splattering Daniel's flannel with river shine. They collapsed together, panting, drenched, and briefly weightless in the tall spring stalks. "You did it," Daniel whispered into wet fur. "You're not afraid anymore." Echo just breathed. "Answer," and no apology. They spent the afternoon barefoot on the bank, toes cooling in the current. Echo's coat dried in patchy swirls. Daniel worried a reed between his fingers. I used to think healing was straight, he mused. One right choice after another until everything snapped back in place. Echo tilted his head, inviting more. It isn't, Daniel said. It loops. You return to the same river with a different heart. He glanced at the water, the same current that had almost swallowed a skeletal dog one stormy night and, by rescue, given Daniel a reason to step outside himself. Now it ran gentler, yet unchanged. The work had been inside them, not the river. Echo pressed his chin to Daniel's thigh. They watched a reed drift downstream, proof that letting go could look effortless. That evening, Daniel framed the day's best photo. Echo mid-a-leap, droplets frozen like stars. He hung it above the hearth, higher than the mayor's plaque or the newspaper clipping about the boy Echo had saved. Beneath the frame, Echo curled by the fire knot guarding, just home. Night deepened, and the wind strummed the pines. Daniel unfolded an attic-stale photo album on the rug. Echo lay against his leg, warmth, anchoring memory. First pages, 2 freckled boys under a summer sun, Daniel grinning, Ben's taller shadow pitched protectively across him. Pancakes, slingshots, hand-me-down heroics. Then fatigues, harder smiles, an ROTC cap angled as if toward some necessary horizon. Daniel's finger hovered over the obituary clipping. Local soldier killed in ambush Gedant, Benjamin A. Whitaker, 23. He'd refused the funeral, thinking denial could hold the coffin shut. The tears came anyway, as fresh as river water. Echo nudged his hand. Daniel threaded fingers through coarse fur and let the ache speak. I wondered if he was watching, he confessed. If I made him ashamed hiding up here. Echo's amber eyes said, keep going. You remind me of him, how you stand between me and the dark, but still expect me to carry my weight. Daniel placed a snapshot of Ben and their mother on the mantel. I think you were sent for me. Echo's exhale was steady as a vow. Daniel closed the album. Naming grief had not reopened the wound. It had drained the fever. I kept going, Ben, he whispered toward the flames. And I'm not alone anymore. Morning mist silvered the water. Echo returned to the bend alone, paws sinking into cool mud. He studied the river's glassy surface until the breeze cleared it like a curtain and met his reflection without flinching. Months ago, that face was a ghost, hip bones sharp, eyes haunted by orders and cages and the roar of floodwater. Today, the shoulders were broad, the coat full, the gaze open. Scarred, yes, but claimed. Echo waded in up to the chest and sat, letting the chill-knit muscle to memory. Boots crunched behind him. Daniel waited on the bank, journal closed. No hurry, no heel, just faith. Water lapped over Echo's paws, neither trap nor test. He pictured the boy he'd hauled from a pond, coughing back life in Echo's jaws the moment purpose replaced terror. And he knew. He had not been restored to the soldier he once was. He'd evolved into a guardian who chose. A child's laughter rang faintly from the park beyond the trees. Echo's ears flicked alert but not alarmed. He turned to Daniel, climbed the bank, and pressed his forehead into Daniel's chest. Droplets slipped from his coat like the last shards of earlier selves. Daniel scratched behind his ears. You've come a long way, bud. The river behind them kept flowing, indifferent yet generous. Past horrors were etched in bone and memory, but no longer bore the leash. Side by side, man and dog took the path home, neither racing ahead nor lagging behind, simply walking in cadence with spring. Their circle, once fractured by war and water, had closed not by erasing the break, but by forging a stronger seam where it had healed. And the river, once feared as an ending, shimmered quietly behind them, forever the place of rescue, and now the place of return. The morning light came softer now, no longer cutting through the trees like a blade, but filtering gently, golden, warm. It lit the path as Daniel and Echo walked the winding trail near the edge of town steps, steady, quiet, familiar. There was no rush, no destination, only rhythm. Daniel's boots crunched over fallen leaves, and beside him, Echo's paws moved with easy certainty. Their pace had become second nature, like breathing, like memory, but without burden. It was not a walk for escape anymore. It was a walk for presence. Every day now began this way. No alarms, No past chasing him from sleep. Just Echo's nudge against his hand. A soft chuff near his chest. A reminder. We're here. We're okay. They hiked a little farther each day past the ridge that overlooked the valley. Beyond the patch of wild daisies, Echo always paused to sniff. Daniel no longer asked why. He let the dog take his time. That small act, pausing, waiting, had changed something in Daniel, too. It taught him patience again. And attention. At the base of the trail, the earth gave way to the gravel lane that led toward the heart of town. They didn't talk, but then they never needed to. Connection had found its home in the silence between them. The Saturday farmers market came into view next, humming with life. Booths of fresh produce lined the sidewalk. The scent of cinnamon and baked bread drifted through the breeze. Echo's ears perked at the sound of children's laughter bouncing off the canvas tents. It had taken time weeks of slow introductions, of careful boundaries, but Echo was now a familiar sight here. The man with the dog who didn't bark, the one who always sat politely by the coffee stand while Daniel spoke softly with the vendors. "Good to see you, Echo," an older man with suspenders and a silver beard greeted, tossing a small biscuit down to the dog. "Still keeping him out of trouble?" Daniel smiled. "He's more responsible than I am." "Oh." Echo waited until Daniel nodded before accepting the treat, tail wagging in its quiet, deliberate way. No spectacle, just acknowledgement. They walked on. A little boy tugged on his mother's hand nearby, eyes wide. "Mom, is that the dog from the news?" Daniel heard her whisper back. "Yes, sweetie. That's Echo, the one who saved that boy in the pond." The boy stared. Echo, sensing the gaze, turned and met it calmly, ears forward, body still. Then, gently, Echo wagged his tail. The boy grinned. And that was enough. They moved on. These were the small connections Daniel had once avoided. He had built his days like wall-shy, thick, safe. But Echo, without trying, had made those walls unnecessary. They didn't need to fight the past. They just needed life again. After the market, they stopped by Mrs. Halpern's cottage. A widow in her 80s, she'd lived alone since her husband passed 5 winters ago. Her dog, Millier, senior beagle with cloudy eyes and a heart of gold, had grown too frail for long walks. So Daniel and Echo began taking her out every other day. It wasn't much, just a loop around the block, but it mattered. Mrs. Halpern greeted them in her robe, her white curls pinned up and her face lit with gratitude. "You're a blessing," she'd said once, clasping Daniel's hands. "Both of you." Echo always sat beside her porch swing while Daniel clipped Millie's leash. The two dogs walked side by side, Echo slowing to match Millie's pace, occasionally nudging her gently when she wandered too far off the curb. They were a mismatched Perron, sleek and alert, the other waddling and wide-eyed, but somehow they made sense together, just like Daniel and Echo had. When the walk ended, Mrs. Halpern would give Echo a dried chicken strip and pat his head. "You're a good boy," she'd whisper. "Thank you for lending your heart." Daniel never corrected her, because she was right. Their days blurred together like this, not in monotony but in meaning. Helping fix the broken fence behind the local library, raking leaves outside the school on Tuesday mornings, sitting at the edge of the town square as high schoolers passed, asking if they could pet Echo. It wasn't hero work, not like before, but it was important. It was a life rebuilt not through grand gestures, but through kindness. Daniel had come to understand something simple, something Echo had taught him without ever speaking. Healing didn't require forgetting. It required choosing to show up again, choosing to soften, little by little, into the spaces that used to hurt. And as Echo trotted ahead slightly on the path toward home, pausing only to glance back with that steady gaze, Daniel realized this wasn't just a routine. It was a tether to the world again. Echo, once adrift in fear, had become an anchor, not just for Daniel, but for others too. A gentle, silent offering of what survival could look like when shared. As they approached the front porch, Daniel saw the envelope waiting by the door. Another hand-drawn picture from the local elementary school. Echo in crayon, his ears too big, his eyes lopsided but heart above his head. Again, beneath it, in shaky handwriting, "You make us feel safe. Thank you, Echo." And Daniel smiled and tucked it under his arm. Echo sat, tail sweeping across the porch. Their home had grown bigger not in walls, but in reach. And as Daniel opened the door, he realized this was no longer a quiet life. It was a connected one. The email arrived on a bright Wednesday, tucked between an online utility bill and an ad for discounted hiking boots. Its subject line was simple: Therapause Outreach Inquiry. Daniel almost deleted it, assuming spam, but something, maybe the capital P in the middle, made him click. Hello, Mr. Whitaker. I coordinate Therapause of Cascadia, a volunteer program that pairs certified therapy dogs with local hospitals and schools. Your dog, Echo, was recommended to us by the Pine Haven librarian. She says he spends Tuesdays napping at her circulation desk. We wondered if you'd consider bringing him for an assessment. We believe he could help our pediatric oncology patients. Best, Marisol Vega. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Outside the open window, Echo dozed on the porch, chin on his paws, sunlight modeling his coat. The notion of that same dogance, skeletal, terrified, half-feral trotting antiseptic hallways and comforting children, felt surreal. He rubbed his thumb across the trackpad, reading the email again. Therapy dog, Children's Hospital. He pictured IV poles, beeping monitors, little hands clutching blankets. Was Echo ready for that kind of closeness? Was Daniel? 2 days later, Daniel found himself in the community center gymnasium, Echo at his side. Folding tables had been arranged in a U shape, and half a dozen dogs' golden retrievers, a standard poodle, even a one-eyed pug waited with their handlers. A banner read Therapause Behavioral Assessment Welcome. Echo scanned the room, alert but calm. Daniel's fingers tightened on the leather leash. Marisol, mid-30s, silver streak in her bun, greeted them with a clipboard and a bright smile. Echo? You must be Echo. She crouched, offering her hand palm down. Echo sniffed, sat politely, tail sweeping once. Well, Marisol laughed, jotting a note. He already has better manners than most of our volunteers. The assessment was straightforward. Walking past crutches and wheelchairs, ignoring dropped lunch meat, enduring gentle hugs from a stranger. Echo passed each task with a quiet grace that made Daniel's chest tighten. When a little girl volunteer wrapped her arms around his neck, Echo merely leaned in and licked the tears of giggles from her cheek. Afterward, Marisol pulled Daniel aside. If you're comfortable, we'd love him on rounds next Tuesday. The kids on the 4th floor haven't had a visit since our Labradoodle retired. Daniel glanced at Echo, now nose to nose with the pug, as though exchanging mission intel. Let me think on it, he said. That night, Daniel sat by the hearth, the glow of the fire tremoring across the petition form still tucked in the drawer. Echo lay against his feet. Daniel's mind teetered. Hospital sterility, fluorescent lights, things that once triggered flashbacks in himself and panic in Echo. Was he about to drag them both back into corridors of beeping alarms and antiseptic memory? He spoke aloud, voice soft. They want you to help sick kids. Echo opened one eye, ears twitching. You've saved lives before, Daniel continued, half smiling. But this is different. No sirens, no orders, just kindness. Echo shifted, resting his head on Daniel's knee, his silent way of saying, I'm listening. Daniel exhaled. All right then, let's try. Echo's tail thumped once, gentle against the rug. The elevator doors slid open to a corridor painted with cartoon whales. The smell of lemon disinfectant mingled with vanilla pudding from a lunch cart. Echo walked beside Daniel, vest emblazoned. There, a pause please, pet me. Small faces peered from doorways, eyes widening. Look, it's Echo, a nurse announced. The first room held Maya, age 5. Bald from chemo, but wrapped in a purple mermaid blanket. She looked tiny against the pillows. Echo approached slowly, Daniel giving slack. When Maya reached out a trembling hand, Echo nuzzled into her palm, then laid his great head gently across her lap. Maya's eyes flooded, but she smiled. Huge, unstoppable. His fur's soft, she whispered. Next was Leo, 8, recovering from spinal surgery. He couldn't sit up yet. Echo adjusted, front legs folding so he could lay his muzzle on the mattress within reach of Leo's fingers. The boy traced the scar on Echo's flank. Does that hurt? Leo asked. Not anymore, Daniel answered, but his gaze was on Echo, who met it calmly. Healing, recognized, healing. Room after room, the pattern repeated. Anxiety softened, shoulders lowered, Monitors still beeped, but the air shifted. Echo seemed to know when to stand tall for photos, when to curl up for stories, when to simply breathe beside a child too weary to talk. Hours later in the family lounge, Marisol found Daniel wiping his eyes. "You okay?" she asked. Daniel laughed shakily. "Thought I was helping them," he said, "but they're helping me." Marisol squeezed his arm.
That's how it works.
Across the room, Echo lay belly up, allowing a toddler to count his paws out of order. Each time the child reached 9, Echo flicked his tail like a metronome of patience. Driving home, the cab of the truck felt lighter somehow. Daniel glanced over. Echo sat happily panting, a crayon, drawn badge stickered crookedly to his therapy vest. "My hero, M. quote. You were good today," Daniel said. Echo yawned, the contented, full-body kind that dogs do when the world feels safe. Daniel's hand tightened on the steering wheel, not from tension, but gratitude so deep it startled him. "Guess the mission's changed," he added. "But the heart of it's the same. Keep people safe. Show them they're not alone." Echo turned his head, amber eyes reflecting the late afternoon sun. In them, Daniel saw every checkpoint passed. River, panic, firelight, reflection, and now hospital hallways reclaimed for joy. He reached across and scratched behind Echo's ear. "Ready for next Tuesday?" Echo's tail thumped the seat. Daniel laughed. "Yeah, me too." And the road unwound before them, not toward a battlefield, not toward isolation, but toward Tuesdays filled with tiny hands and brave smiles, a new routine of service, chosen freely by a dog who once feared water, and by a man who once feared living. The late summer sky tilted toward dusk, washing the valley in honeyed light. Shadows stretched long over the porch railings of Daniel's cabin, and cicadas struck up their slow, rhythmic chorus. Inside, a single lamp glowed beside the desk that faced the window, a small circle of amber in a room gone quietly gold. Daniel sat hunched over his journal, the leather cover creased and soft from years of thumbprints. A mug of chamomile cooled beside him, untouched. Outside the screen door, Echo paced the porch, nails ticking softly on wood, every so often pausing to nose the breeze as if tasting what evening had to say. Daniel twirled the pen once between his fingers, then set it to the page. Asterisk. The 27th of August. The day was ordinary therapy rounds in the morning, grocery stop at noon. Echo stealing half my sandwich at 3. He smiled, shook his head, and added, "But somewhere between the hospital elevator and the trail home, I realized ordinary feels nothing like it used to. Ordinary now means children's laughter where there used to be beeping monitors and fear. It means neighbors waving because they know the dog's namer name better than the weather." He paused, listening to Echo settle on the top step outside, with a long, satisfied sigh. "I once thought I saved a dog, but I met a soul. We're both still learning how to live together." He set the pen down, reading the lines a final time. No edits, no second guessing. Truth as plain and steady as Echo's heartbeat. A soft whine drifted through the screen door. Daniel closed the journal, slid it into the desk drawer, and rose. When he stepped onto the porch, the last flare of daylight caught Echo's coat, turning black to bronze, tan to molten copper. The river below flashed back the same color, a liquid mirror of the sinking sun. "Walk?" Daniel asked. Echo stood, tail giving one deliberate sweep. No leash these days, they trusted the trail and each other. They moved side by side down the familiar path, grass whispering underfoot. The air smelled of warm stone and ripening berries. Every few yards, Echo veered to investigate a rustle, always returning to Daniel's shoulder without a call. Halfway to the river, Daniel stopped at a rise where the view spilled wide. Forest, water, sky stitched together by golden light. This was where it had begun, where fear once ruled them both. Tonight it felt like the safest place on earth. Echo sat, following Daniel's gaze. A flock of swallows wheeled overhead, their silhouettes dark commas against the setting sun. Daniel breathed in, felt his chest loosen, and spoke, more to the horizon than to himself. "Funny thing about circles," he said. "You end up where you started, but you're not the same." Echo's ears flicked at the word circle. He leaned gently against Daniel's thigh. They resumed walking, descending the slope until river stones crunched beneath their feet. The current murmured, low and sure. Daniel removed his boots, let the cool water lick his toes. Echo waded knee-deep, nose skimming the surface, then turned to look back-checking. Always. "I'm here," Daniel assured him. They stayed until the sun kissed the ridgeline, turning the water to molten glass. Dragonflies darted like sparks. Daniel watched Echo's reflection ripple beside his own and felt a swell of gratitude that had no edge, no language. "When they ask how we did it," he murmured, "I'll tell them you taught me the simplest thing. Stay." Echo padded out of the water, shook sprays of sunset droplets into the air, and pressed his wet head against Daniel's hand. The gesture said everything words couldn't. "I stayed because you did." Crickets tuned their violins as they headed home. The sky shifted to lavender, then bruised blue. Fireflies blinked on, a constellation at ankle height, lighting their path like runway lamps. Near the cabin door, Daniel paused. "One more thing," he said, crouching to Echo's eye level. "If tomorrow brings something new, another hospital wing, another kid who needs you, just know we go together. Always." Echo's tail thumped twice in the dust. Inside, Daniel placed the journal on the fireplace mantel beside the crayon drawing of Echo with the heart over his head and the folded petition form no longer needed. He lit a single lamp, enough to cast twin shadow-sown man, one dog stretching long across the wooden floorboards. Outside, through the open door, night gathered, deep and velvet. Daniel clicked off the lamp. Moonlight pooled across the threshold. "Ready?" he asked. Echo answered by stepping forward, shoulder brushing Daniel's leg. They crossed the porch, descended the steps, and continued down the path not as rescuer and rescued, not as soldier and tool, but simply as Daniel and Ekatwo's souls stitched together by water, firelight, and quiet acts of saving. The camera pulls back past the cabin roof, glinting silver, past the river, threading through shadowed pines, up into the wide bowl of stars. Two figures shrink to silhouettes, walking a ribbon of moonlit earth until distance folds them into the night. And in the hush that follows, only the soft pad of paws and the steady tread of boots remain fading, but certain testament that sometimes the bravest stories end not in thunder, but in the simple promise of footsteps taken side by side, ever forward into the gold-tipped dark. When we open our lives to an animal, something gentle and enduring takes root. A love that doesn't measure our worth. A loyalty that stands guard even on our hardest days. German Shepherds embody that gift in a powerful way, courage wrapped in steady eyes, always ready to meet us where we are and walk a little farther together. In Echo's journey, maybe you recognized a piece of your own story. The quiet mornings, the unspoken comfort, the sense that a wagging tail can stitch the world back together. If you've been wondering how to deepen that bond with the dog who's already stolen your heart, you might enjoy a resource I keep bookmarked myself, the American Kennel Club's free Canine Good Citizen Guide. It's less a training manual than a collection of gentle habits that turn ordinary moments into shared trust. Have a look whenever the mood feels right. No rush, no pressure, just another path you and your companion can explore, side by side. Until then, keep walking, keep listening, and let that four-legged loyalty remind you every day that love really can be as simple and as profound as staying close.